I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I was wrong. My name is Sarah, and for 34 years I believed my parents simply preferred my younger sister, Jessica. I accepted being the family ATM, the forgotten daughter, the one who paid for everyone else's dreams while mine didn't matter. But 1 week before Jessica's wedding, they crossed a line I never saw coming. "Give us your villa for the wedding, or you're banned from the family forever." My father's voice was ice cold through the phone. My oceanfront villa, the one I built from nothing, my sanctuary, my greatest achievement, they wanted it as their playground. Jessica laughed in the background. She should be grateful we're even letting her exist in this family. I agreed. Just like that. Of course you can have it. They thought they'd finally broken me. They had no idea they'd just awakened something far more dangerous. On the wedding morning, 200 guests in designer gowns and tuxedos arrived at my villa gates. The cream of California society, local politicians, news reporters, everyone Jessica wanted to impress with her perfect day. But the gates stayed locked. My family screamed my name, begging, threatening, pleading. Then the construction trucks arrived, hanging official signs. Construction site. No entry. What happened next destroyed my family so completely that some of them are still in prison today. You see, I didn't just lock them out of my villa. I uncovered secrets that shattered everything they thought they knew about money, blood, and revenge. This is the story of how I went from family doormat to their worst nightmare, and why they never saw it coming. Stay with me. The real shocks are just beginning. My name is Sarah Michelle Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a senior software architect at one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious tech companies. By every measurable standard, my life should feel like a triumph. I've climbed from a junior developer fresh out of college to leading multi-million-dollar projects that power applications used by millions of people worldwide. My annual salary places me in the top 5% of earners in California, and I've built a career that my younger self could only dream of. But success, I've learned, doesn't automatically heal the wounds carved by a lifetime of being treated as if you don't quite belong in your own family. Standing on the wraparound deck of my oceanfront villa in Malibu, watching the Pacific waves crash against the rocky coastline below, I can almost convince myself that none of that matters anymore. This house, my house, represents everything I've accomplished through sheer determination and countless 60-hour work weeks. The 3-bedroom Mediterranean-style villa, with its terracotta roof tiles and hand-painted ceramic accents, took me 2 years to find and another year to renovate exactly to my specifications. Every morning when I wake up to the sound of seagulls and ocean breeze flowing through the custom French doors, I'm reminded that I built this life entirely on my own terms. The villa sits on nearly an acre of prime coastal real estate, complete with an infinity pool that seems to pour directly into the horizon, a professionally landscaped garden filled with native California plants, and a wine cellar that I've carefully curated over the past 5 years. It's not just a house. It's my sanctuary, my proof that Sarah Thompson doesn't need anyone else's approval to create something beautiful and meaningful. Yet even here in this space that belongs entirely to me, I can't escape the familiar ache that accompanies every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone celebration, where the pattern repeats itself with clockwork precision. My parents, Robert and Patricia Thompson, have perfected the art of making me feel like a stranger at my own family's table. They've been doing it for so long that I sometimes wonder if they even realize they're doing it anymore, or if treating me as an afterthought has simply become their default setting. The dynamic established itself early and never wavered. While my younger sister Jessica was celebrated for every minor achievement, making the junior varsity cheerleading squad, getting a C+ on a test she'd previously failed choosing a college major, my accomplishments were met with polite nods and immediate subject changes. When I graduated summa cum laude with a computer science degree from Stanford, the family dinner conversation focused on Jessica's decision to switch her major from communications to art history. When I received my first major promotion and salary increase, my parents spent the evening discussing Jessica's latest boyfriend and whether he might be the one. It wasn't malicious, exactly. It was something more insidious, a complete inability to see me as worthy of the same attention, pride, and celebration they showered on Jessica without question. I became the family's reliable background character, the one who could be counted on to send money when Dad's small business hit rough patches to pay for Mom's medical bills, when insurance fell short to cover Jessica's credit card debt, when her part-time retail job couldn't keep up with her shopping habits. And I did it all willingly, desperately hoping that eventually my generosity would earn me a place at the table that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Jessica, meanwhile, grew up beautiful, charming, and completely accustomed to being the center of attention wherever she went. At 29, she still lives in our parents' guest house, works sporadically as a part-time social media coordinator for a local boutique, and has never paid her own rent, car insurance, or phone bill. She's never had to. Why would she, when the family had already established that Jessica's comfort and happiness were everyone's primary concern, and that Sarah's role was to provide the financial stability that made Jessica's carefree lifestyle possible? The irony isn't lost on me that I've achieved everything my parents claimed they wanted for their daughters: financial independence, professional success, home ownership in one of the most expensive markets in the country. Yet Jessica remains their obvious favorite, despite having achieved none of those things. It's taught me that love, at least in my family, isn't earned through accomplishment or reliability. It's simply bestowed arbitrarily and absolutely, and apparently I wasn't chosen to receive it. Standing here now, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, I feel a familiar mixture of gratitude for what I've built and sadness for what I've never had. This villa represents my independence, my success, and my ability to create beauty and peace in my own life. It's my greatest achievement and my favorite retreat from a world that often feels indifferent to my efforts. I had no idea that this very villa would soon become a battlefield soaked in family tears. The memories of that favoritism run so deep that even now, surrounded by all the success I've built, certain dates on the calendar still make my chest tighten with that old familiar ache. My 21st birthday stands out as particularly painful, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing happened at all. I had graduated early from Stanford just 2 months before, landed my first software development job, and moved into my own apartment for the first time. I thought surely this milestone birthday, combined with my recent achievements, would warrant some acknowledgement from my family. I spent the entire day waiting for a phone call that never came. By evening, I finally called home myself, hoping maybe they had planned a surprise or simply gotten busy with their own lives. Mom answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. When I gently mentioned that it was my birthday, there was a long pause before she said, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. We're at Jessica's school for her spring dance performance. You know how important these events are for her college applications." Jessica was 17 at the time, and this was a small community college dance recital that maybe 30 people attended. But it took priority over acknowledging that their older daughter had just turned 21. The contrast with Jessica's birthday celebrations was so stark it felt deliberately cruel. For her 18th birthday, my parents threw a party that rivaled a wedding reception. They rented the community center, hired a DJ, ordered a 3-tier cake from an expensive bakery, and invited over 100 people. I contributed $500 toward the party expenses without being asked, and spent the entire evening watching extended family and friends congratulate my parents on raising such a wonderful daughter. Jessica wore a tiara and gave a speech about how grateful she was for her amazing family support system. I stood in the back, taking photos with my phone, feeling like hired help at my own sister's celebration. That pattern of ignored achievements versus celebrated mediocrity defined our childhood and followed us into adulthood. When I made the dean's list, 3 consecutive semesters at Stanford, my parents briefly mentioned it to their friends as an afterthought before launching into detailed stories about Jessica's role as a background dancer in her community college's production of Grease. When I received a commendation from my company's CEO for leading a project that saved them $2 million in operational costs, the family dinner conversation centered around Jessica's decision to get highlights in her hair and how beautiful she looked with the new color. The most painful memory involves my college graduation day. I had worked multiple jobs throughout school to minimize my student loan debt, maintained a 3.9 GPA while completing a demanding computer science program, and graduated with honors from one of the most prestigious universities in the country. I was the first person in my family to graduate from a 4-year university, let alone one of Stanford's caliber. The ceremony was on a Sunday morning in May, and I had sent my parents the information months in advance, even offering to pay for their hotel and travel expenses. 2 days before graduation, Jessica announced that she had been selected to perform a solo piece at her community college's Spring Arts Showcase, which happened to be scheduled for the same weekend. Without any discussion or apparent internal conflict, my parents decided to attend Jessica's performance instead. Dad called to explain that Jessica's showcase was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and that my graduation was just a ceremony that I could enjoy with my friends. He suggested we celebrate my achievement with dinner sometime the following week, when they returned from Jessica's performance weekend in Sacramento. I sat alone in that vast stadium watching thousands of other graduates celebrate with their families, taking pictures with proud parents, sharing tears of joy and accomplishment. My roommate's mother took a photo of me receiving my diploma, and later that evening her family invited me to their celebration dinner because they couldn't bear the thought of me spending such an important day alone. That photograph still sits on my desk at work, a reminder of both my achievement and the profound loneliness that accompanied what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. The pattern extended to every milestone in my career. When I received my first major promotion to senior developer, Jessica had just started dating someone new, and the family conversation revolved around whether this boyfriend had serious potential. When I bought my first condo at 28, using a down payment I had saved entirely on my own, Jessica had decided to change her major for the 3rd time, and my parents spent hours discussing how to best support her through this challenging transition period. Meanwhile, I became the family's reliable financial resource. When Dad's small accounting firm lost a major client and struggled to make payroll, I quietly transferred money to help bridge the gap. When Mom needed dental work that insurance wouldn't cover, I paid the entire bill without being asked. When Jessica's car broke down, I bought her a reliable used vehicle that she still drives today. Each time my assistance was accepted with casual gratitude, as if my ability to help was simply a natural resource they could tap whenever needed. The most crushing realization came during Jessica's 25th birthday party, which my parents organized with the same elaborate attention they had always lavished on her celebrations. I had just purchased my villa, the culmination of years of careful saving and career advancement. When I mentioned the house purchase to a cousin hoping someone might acknowledge this major life achievement, my aunt responded with polite interest before immediately turning to compliment Jessica on her new haircut. Later that evening, I overheard my parents telling friends about Jessica's artistic vision and creative spirit, describing her part-time retail work as if she were curating museum exhibitions. Sitting in my car after that party, I finally understood that nothing I accomplished would ever earn me the unconditional pride and attention that Jessica received simply for existing. The favoritism wasn't based on achievement, effort, or even potential. It was absolute and inexplicable, carved in stone, before either of us had the chance to prove ourselves worthy or unworthy of love. But I never expected that this favoritism was just the beginning of a much deeper wound. That deeper wound revealed itself on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 1 week before Jessica's wedding to her fiancé, Michael Rodriguez. I was in my home office reviewing code for a critical product launch when my phone rang with Dad's contact information lighting up the screen. The timing felt unusual since my parents rarely called during weekday evenings, preferring to save family communications for weekend conversations that could be kept brief and superficial. Dad's voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before, a combination of determination and barely concealed irritation that made me immediately sit up straighter in my chair. "Sarah, We need to talk about Jessica's wedding. He began without any preliminary pleasantries or inquiry about my well-being. There's been a situation with the venue, and we need you to step up for your sister like family should. The venue situation, as he explained it, involved a last-minute cancellation due to a plumbing emergency that had flooded the reception hall Jessica had booked 18 months earlier. According to Dad, the venue couldn't be repaired in time, their deposit was non-refundable, and they had no backup plan for hosting 200 guests in 6 days. As he spoke, I could hear the familiar expectation in his voice, the assumption that I would automatically provide whatever solution the family needed without question or hesitation. "We need to use your villa for the ceremony and reception," he stated, not asked. "It's the perfect size, the ocean view will be beautiful for photos, and Jessica has always dreamed of a beachfront wedding. You can stay somewhere else for the weekend, maybe get a hotel room in town. The family will handle all the setup and cleanup, so you won't need to worry about any of the details." Before I could respond, Mom's voice joined the conversation as Dad switched to speakerphone. "Honey, this is Jessica's special day." She added, her tone carrying that particular blend of guilt and manipulation that had been perfected over decades of family interactions. "She's been planning this wedding for 2 years, and everything needs to be perfect. You understand how important this is, don't you? Family supports family during these crucial moments." Then Jessica's voice cut through the background, sharp and dismissive, in a way that immediately transported me back to childhood moments when she had demanded my toys, my space, or my time with casual entitlement. "Sarah better not make this difficult," she said loud enough for me to hear clearly. "She should be grateful we're even including her in the wedding after how weird and antisocial she's been lately. Honestly, letting us use her house is the least she can do to contribute something meaningful to this family." The word contribute hit me like a physical blow. After years of financial support, after paying for countless family emergencies, after consistently prioritizing their needs over my own comfort and security, Jessica still viewed me as someone who hadn't contributed meaningfully to the family. The casual cruelty of her assessment took my breath away, but it was Dad's response that truly shocked me. "If you can't do this for your sister Sarah, then maybe you shouldn't be part of the wedding at all," he said, his voice cold and final. "We've already sent the invitations, made all the arrangements, and told everyone about the beautiful ocean setting. Jessica deserves to have her perfect day, and if you're not willing to help make that happen, then perhaps it's better if you just stay away entirely. We can't have negative energy affecting such an important celebration." The ultimatum hung in the air between us, as clear and brutal as anything my parents had ever said to me. Provide your home for Jessica's convenience, or be banished from the family celebration entirely. Accept your role as the family's resource to be utilized when needed, or forfeit your place at the table altogether. The choice they made clear was entirely mine, but only one option would be acceptable to them. My first instinct was to refuse immediately. The villa was my sanctuary, my private space, my most precious possession. The thought of strangers trampling through my carefully curated home of Jessica, treating my personal haven as her temporary playground, felt like a violation I couldn't tolerate. I opened my mouth to tell them no, to explain that they were asking too much, that surely they could find another solution that didn't require sacrificing my comfort and privacy. But before I could speak, Dad continued talking to someone else in the room, apparently forgetting that the call was still connected. His voice became more distant as he turned away from the phone, but the words came through clearly enough to freeze me in place. "She'll agree," he said, presumably to Mom and Jessica. "Sarah always gives in eventually. She's too desperate to be included to actually stand up for herself." Jessica's laughter rang out bright and merciless. "God, it's almost pathetic how predictable she is. Watch, she'll probably even offer to pay for part of the catering or something. She's so desperate to buy her way into being loved by this family." Mom's voice joined in, quieter but equally cutting. "Well, at least she's useful for something. Heaven knows she's never contributed anything else meaningful to family gatherings. Always standing in the corner with that awkward smile, never knowing how to fit in properly. The best part," Jessica continued, her voice gaining momentum with excitement, is that after the wedding, we won't have to deal with her anymore. Michael and I are moving to his family's estate in Napa. You two are planning to downsize and travel, and Sarah will finally get the hint that she doesn't really belong in our family dynamic. This wedding could be the perfect way to transition her out of our lives completely. Dad's voice carried approval and relief. That would solve a lot of problems. She's always been so intense about family inclusion, always trying so hard to insert herself into conversations and celebrations where she doesn't quite fit. It would be easier for everyone if she just naturally faded into the background of our lives. The three of them continued discussing my eventual exclusion with the casual efficiency of people planning a grocery list, weighing the benefits of my gradual disappearance against the temporary usefulness of my villa and financial resources. They spoke about me as if I were a problematic acquaintance they needed to politely distance themselves from, not a daughter and sister who had spent 34 years desperately trying to earn their love and acceptance. In that exact moment, I decided I would tell them yes. I cleared my throat deliberately loud enough to interrupt their conversation and remind them that I was still on the line. The sudden silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about their awareness of what I had just overheard. Dad's voice returned, first artificially bright and slightly breathless, as if he had been caught in the middle of something embarrassing rather than planning my systematic exclusion from the family. "Sarah, are you still there, honey? We were just discussing some of the wedding logistics while we waited for your answer." His attempt at casual normalcy would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing. The fact that he thought I might believe their conversation about my usefulness and eventual disposal was merely wedding planning showed exactly how little intelligence and awareness they credited me with. I let the silence stretch for several long seconds, partly to collect my thoughts, and partly to let them squirm in their uncertainty about how much I had heard. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured, carrying none of the hurt or anger that was currently burning through my chest like acid. "Of course I'll let Jessica use the villa for her wedding," I said, infusing my tone with exactly the kind of eager-to-please accommodation they had come to expect from me over the years. I should have offered immediately, "Family comes first, and Jessica deserves to have her perfect day in a perfect setting." The relief in Dad's voice was immediate and unmistakable. "That's wonderful, Sarah. I knew we could count on you to do the right thing for your sister. This is going to mean everything to Jessica, and we're so grateful for your generosity." Jessica's voice bubbled with excitement and triumph, apparently having no concern about whether I might have overheard her earlier comments about my patheticness and eventual exclusion. "Oh my God! Sarah, this is going to be absolutely amazing. The ocean backdrop will be perfect for photos, and my wedding planner is going to die when she sees the space. You're literally saving my entire wedding. I can't wait to tell Michael that we're going to have the most beautiful ceremony location in all of California." Mom chimed in with maternal warmth that felt particularly hollow given what I had just heard. "This is such a loving gesture, honey. Family support like this is what makes these special occasions truly meaningful. Jessica will remember your kindness for the rest of her life." As they continued expressing their gratitude and excitement, I found myself studying their words with a detachment I had never experienced before in family conversations. Every phrase of appreciation felt calculated, designed to reinforce my role as the accommodating sister who could be relied upon to sacrifice her comfort for Jessica's benefit. Their relief was so palpable that it confirmed they had genuinely worried I might refuse, which suggested they understood exactly how much they were asking of me. "I'll need to make arrangements to stay elsewhere for the weekend," I said, maintaining my helpful, compliant tone while my mind began working through possibilities and logistics that had nothing to do with finding myself a hotel room. "And I assume you'll want access to the property a day or two early for setup and decorating." "That would be perfect," Dad responded immediately. "Jessica's wedding planner will probably want Thursday and Friday to transform the space. I know it's an imposition, but having those extra days will really ensure everything is flawless." "No imposition at all," I assured him, already calculating the timeline I would need for my own preparations. "I want Jessica to have complete access to create her dream wedding. Should I leave my keys somewhere, or would you prefer that I hand them over directly?" "Actually, Jessica interjected. "It would probably be easier if you just left them under the garden rock by the front door. That way we can get started whenever the vendors arrive and you won't have to coordinate your schedule with ours. We're going to be incredibly busy with last-minute preparations." The casual dismissal in her suggestion struck me as particularly revealing. Even when asking to use my home, Jessica couldn't bring herself to request a proper handover meeting or express interest in seeing me before the wedding day. I was being treated like an absent landlord, whose property they were temporarily commandeering, not a sister whose generosity was making their celebration possible. "That sounds perfect," I replied, making mental notes about key locations and access points, while projecting nothing but sisterly cooperation. "I'll make sure the house is completely ready for your use and stay out of your way entirely. The last thing I want is to cause any stress during such an important week." "You're the best, Sarah," Mom said, her voice warm with the kind of affection that appeared exclusively when I was providing something the family needed. This kind of selflessness is exactly what family should be about. Jessica is so lucky to have a sister who puts her happiness first. After we ended the call, I sat in my office for nearly an hour, staring out at the ocean, while my mind processed what had just occurred. The conversation had revealed several crucial pieces of information that I couldn't ignore. First, my family genuinely believed I was too desperate for inclusion to ever stand up for myself in any meaningful way. Second, they felt comfortable discussing my removal from their lives because they assumed I would never discover their true intentions. Third, they had planned to use this wedding as a transition point for cutting me out permanently while still extracting maximum benefit from my resources. Most importantly, they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of. They saw a pathetic, desperate woman clinging to family relationships that brought her nothing but pain. They failed to see the strategic mind that had built a successful tech career, the analytical skills that had guided complex software projects to completion, and the careful planning abilities that had created the financial security they had been exploiting for years. Their assumption that I would meekly accept their timeline for my disposal was their first major miscalculation. Their belief that I would hand over my home without any conditions or considerations was their second. Their confidence that I had no idea what they truly thought of me was their third and most critical error. As I opened my laptop and began researching property law, event permitting requirements, and construction regulations, I felt a clarity of purpose that had been missing from my life for years. For the first time in our relationship, I held all the cards while they remained completely unaware that a game had even begun. They thought I had surrendered, but I had just begun loading the ammunition. As I sat there with my laptop open researching the legal frameworks that would make my plan possible, other memories began surfacing with startling clarity, each one adding fuel to the determination that was rapidly crystallizing in my chest. These weren't the general recollections of favoritism I had been carrying for years, but specific moments of betrayal so sharp and deliberate that they had carved permanent scars in my sense of self-worth. The most devastating memory involved my high school graduation, an event that should have represented the culmination of 4 years of academic excellence and the launching point for my future success. I had graduated as valedictorian with a full scholarship to Stanford achievements that represented not just personal triumph, but validation that all my hard work and sacrifice had been worthwhile. For weeks leading up to the ceremony, I had imagined my parents in the audience finally seeing me as someone worthy of their pride and attention. The graduation was scheduled for a Saturday evening in June, with the ceremony beginning at 7 o'clock in the school's main auditorium. I had given my parents the information months in advance, ordering extra tickets for extended family members, and even offering to arrange a celebration dinner afterward at a restaurant of their choosing. They had seemed appropriately enthusiastic, with Mom mentioning how excited she was to see me give the valedictorian speech and Dad joking about finally having a Stanford graduate in the family. 3 days before graduation, Jessica announced that she had been selected to perform a solo piece in her community college's spring music showcase, a casual evening event that featured student performances in various musical genres. The showcase was scheduled for the same Saturday as my graduation, beginning at 6 o'clock at a small theater about 40 minutes from our house. When I learned about the timing conflict, I initially assumed my parents would attend my graduation ceremony, since it represented a far more significant milestone and had been planned for months. Instead, Dad called me on Friday afternoon to explain that they had decided to attend Jessica's performance because she's been working so hard on this piece and she's really nervous about performing solo for the first time. He suggested that I wouldn't really miss them since I would be busy with the ceremony itself and promised they would take me out for a nice dinner the following weekend to celebrate my achievement properly. The casual way he dismissed my graduation ceremony as something I could handle on my own, while treating Jessica's brief musical performance as a family priority that required everyone's presence, revealed everything about their true feelings toward my accomplishments. They weren't missing my graduation due to an unavoidable conflict or emergency. They were choosing Jessica's minor showcase over my major academic milestone because her comfort and confidence mattered more to them than my moment of triumph. Sitting alone in that auditorium, watching other families cheer and take photographs as their children crossed the stage, I felt a loneliness so profound that it overshadowed even the pride of delivering my valedictorian speech to an audience of hundreds. When my name was called and I walked across that stage to receive my diploma with highest honors, the empty seats where my family should have been sitting felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Even more painful was the memory of how they had funded Jessica's car purchase just 2 months before my graduation. I had been carefully saving money from my part-time job at a local bookstore, adding every paycheck to the college fund I had been building since my sophomore year. The fund wasn't large, but it represented hundreds of hours of work and careful budgeting money I had planned to use for textbooks, housing deposits, and other expenses that my scholarship wouldn't cover. When Jessica turned 17, she decided she needed her own car rather than continuing to share Mom's sedan. Instead of encouraging her to get a job and save money like I had done, or helping her find a reliable used vehicle within a reasonable budget, my parents decided she deserved something special for her birthday. They found a sporty convertible at a local dealership, a car that cost nearly $8,000 and represented far more than Jessica's transportation needs. When they realized they didn't have the full amount available, Dad approached me with what he presented as a temporary loan request. "We'll pay you back as soon as the business has a good quarter," he promised, explaining that Jessica's happiness was worth the short-term financial strain. "You understand how important it is for a young woman to feel confident and independent." The irony of using my money to purchase someone else's independence while undermining my own financial security seemed completely lost on him. I handed over nearly $6,000 from my college fund money that represented months of careful saving and sacrifice. True to form, the loan was never repaid, never mentioned again, and never acknowledged as a significant contribution to Jessica's gift. Watching Jessica drive off in her new car, laughing with friends, and completely oblivious to the source of her newfound freedom, I felt something shift inside me that had never quite shifted back. It wasn't just the money, though. Losing my college fund created genuine financial stress for my first year at Stanford. It was the realization that my parents could take something I had worked so hard to build and give it to Jessica without any apparent consideration for how that transfer would affect my life or future. These memories, along with dozens of others that followed the same pattern of sacrifice and dismissal, had taught me that my role in the family was fundamentally different from Jessica's. She was the beloved daughter whose needs and wants took priority over practical considerations or fairness. I was the reliable resource whose contributions enabled Jessica's comfort, while my own struggles remained invisible and unaddressed. For years, I had accepted this dynamic because I believed that eventually my dedication and generosity would earn me the kind of unconditional love and support that Jessica received effortlessly. I had convinced myself that my parents' favoritism was temporary, that they would eventually recognize my worth and treat me as an equal member of the family, rather than a convenient solution to their financial problems. But their conversation about my eventual disposal had shattered that last hope completely. They didn't see me as a daughter who deserved better treatment. They saw me as a problem to be managed and eventually eliminated. The realization that they had been planning my exclusion while continuing to exploit my resources felt like the ultimate betrayal, one that demanded a response proportional to the years of damage they had inflicted. If they once treated me as invisible, now I would force the whole world to see them. The transformation from victim to strategist required a methodical approach that drew on every skill I had developed during my years in the tech industry. Just as I approached complex software projects by breaking them down into manageable components and identifying potential failure points, I began dissecting my family's assumptions and vulnerabilities with the same systematic precision that had made my career successful. My first priority was establishing an unshakable legal foundation for everything that would follow. Monday morning, I called James Morrison, the attorney who had handled my villa purchase 3 years earlier, and scheduled an emergency consultation for that afternoon. When I arrived at his downtown office, I explained that I needed a comprehensive review of my property ownership documentation due to a family situation that might require legal clarity. James pulled my files and spent nearly 2 hours examining every document related to the villa purchase, from the original title search to the final closing papers. His findings were exactly what I had hoped for, but needed to confirm beyond any doubt. The property was registered solely in my name, with no co-signers, no liens beyond my mortgage, which I had been paying independently, and no legal claims from any other party. My parents had never contributed financially to the purchase, had never been listed as co-owners, and had no legal standing to make any demands regarding the property's use. "Sarah, this house is entirely yours," James confirmed, sliding the documentation across his desk. "No one else has any legal right to access this property without your explicit permission. If someone were to use your home for an event without your consent, they could potentially face trespassing charges, especially if they caused any damage or disruption to your neighbors." I asked him to prepare a formal letter documenting my sole ownership, along with a detailed summary of my rights as the property owner. This letter would serve as crucial evidence if legal authorities became involved in what I was planning. James agreed to have everything ready by Wednesday, giving me the documentation I needed well before Jessica's wedding weekend. My next step required careful research into pool renovation and landscaping companies that could accommodate an unusual request with very specific timing requirements. I spent Tuesday evening calling different contractors, explaining that I needed emergency pool resurfacing and extensive landscaping work that had to begin on a particular Saturday morning due to insurance requirements and permit restrictions. The third company I contacted, Coastal Construction and Landscaping, seemed intrigued rather than concerned by my tight timeline. The owner, a woman named Maria Santos, explained that they often handled emergency renovation projects for insurance companies and understood the importance of strict scheduling. When I described the scope of work I needed, including pool drainage surface preparation and comprehensive garden restructuring, she quoted a price that was substantial but not unreasonable for the expedited timeline. "We can have crews on site by 7 in the morning, Maria assured me. "Pool renovation requires heavy machinery and creates significant noise, so we'll need to post official construction zone signs to comply with city noise ordinances. The work area will need to be completely secured to prevent liability issues." I authorized the full project immediately, providing a substantial deposit and signing contracts that specified the exact start date and time. Maria agreed to handle all necessary permits and city notifications, ensuring that everything would be completely legal and properly documented. The construction zone signs and safety barriers would be legitimate and enforceable, making it impossible for anyone to claim the renovation was a fraudulent obstruction. The final component of my preparation involved setting up what appeared to be a thoughtful wedding gift for Jessica, but would actually serve as a crucial element in my larger plan. I contacted an event insurance company and purchased a comprehensive policy that would cover wedding cancellations, vendor failures, and venue-related disasters. The policy was expensive, but it included coverage for situations where venues became unavailable due to construction plumbing failures or other property emergencies. When I filled out the application, I listed Jessica as the primary beneficiary and event organizer, explaining that I was purchasing the insurance as a surprise wedding gift to protect her celebration against unforeseen circumstances. The insurance representative seemed charmed by my sisterly thoughtfulness and expedited the policy approval process. The coverage would become active 48 hours before the wedding date, providing a narrow window during which Jessica could potentially file a claim for venue-related cancellation. I carefully read through every clause and provision in the insurance policy, paying particular attention to the requirements for filing claims and the documentation needed to prove that a venue had become unusable due to legitimate circumstances. Pool renovation qualified as a covered reason for venue unavailability, especially when supported by proper permits and construction contracts. If Jessica chose to file a claim, she would need to provide evidence that the venue cancellation was due to circumstances beyond her control, which my legitimate renovation project would satisfy completely. Throughout these preparations, I maintained my usual routine and demeanor, responding to family calls and messages with the same accommodating tone I had always used. When Mom called to thank me again for my generosity and to ask about key arrangements, I cheerfully confirmed that I would leave them under the garden rock as Jessica had requested. When Jessica texted to ask about parking arrangements for vendors and guests, I provided detailed information about the property layout and assured her that everything would be perfect for her special day. The contrast between my public cooperation and my private preparations created a strange sense of duality in my daily life. During work hours, I functioned normally, attending meetings and managing projects, while my colleagues remained completely unaware of the personal drama I was orchestrating. In the evenings, I continued researching legal precedents, reviewing construction timelines, and refining the details of a plan that would expose my family's true nature to everyone they cared about impressing. By Thursday evening, just 2 days before the wedding, every element was in place. My legal documentation was complete, my construction contracts were signed and scheduled, my insurance policy was active and ready for potential claims. Most importantly, my family remained completely confident that I had surrendered to their demands and would provide exactly the accommodating backdrop they expected for Jessica's perfect day. They wouldn't just lose a wedding, they would lose much more than they could ever imagine. The only person who might have detected the shift in my demeanor was my closest friend, Rachel Chen, who had known me since our graduate school days at Stanford and possessed an uncanny ability to read the subtle changes in my mood and behavior. Rachel worked as a senior project manager at a competing tech firm, and we had maintained our friendship through weekly coffee meetings and regular text conversations that provided both of us with a reliable outlet for professional stress and personal concerns. On Friday morning, less than 24 hours before Jessica's wedding, Rachel called to ask if I wanted to meet for our usual coffee before the weekend festivities began. I had been so focused on finalizing my preparations that I had forgotten to mention the wedding details to her, and when I explained that I would be spending the weekend at a hotel while my family used my villa for Jessica's celebration, her response was immediate and sharp. "Wait, they asked you to give up your house for the weekend, Sarah. That's completely unreasonable. Your villa is your private space, not a rental property for family events." Rachel's voice carried the kind of protective anger that came from years of listening to me describe my family's treatment and watching me make excuses for their behavior. I found myself explaining the venue emergency and the short timeline, describing my family's request as a reasonable solution to an unexpected crisis, rather than the entitled demand it had actually been. But Rachel knew me too well to accept my diplomatic version of events, and she pressed for details about how the conversation had unfolded and whether I had been given any real choice in the matter. "This is the same pattern we've talked about for years," she said, her voice growing more concerned as I reluctantly admitted the ultimatum my parents had presented. "They create a crisis demand that you solve it with your resources and then act like you should be grateful for the opportunity to help them. Sarah, when are you going to stop letting them treat you like their personal emergency fund?" Her words struck closer to the truth than I was comfortable acknowledging, but they also revealed how little she understood about what I was actually planning. Rachel saw me as the perpetual victim in my family dynamic, someone who needed encouragement to stand up for herself, but lacked the courage or strategy to actually change her circumstances. She had no idea that I had moved far beyond the passive acceptance she was urging me to abandon. When we met for coffee that afternoon at our usual cafe near the marina, Rachel studied my face with the intense scrutiny she normally reserved for analyzing project timelines and budget projections. "You look different," she said, settling into her chair with her usual directness. "There's something in your expression that I haven't seen before. Are you actually okay with this wedding situation, or are you planning something?" The question caught me off guard both because of her perceptiveness and because I realized I had been looking forward to having someone witness what I was about to accomplish. For weeks, I had been operating in complete isolation, planning and preparing without anyone to share my anticipation or validate my strategy. Rachel's suspicion felt like an opportunity to test my resolve and perhaps gain an ally in what I was about to do. "I'm not planning anything destructive," I said, carefully choosing my words to be technically accurate while avoiding any details that might alarm her. "I'm just ensuring that everyone involved gets exactly what they deserve based on how they've chosen to treat other people." Rachel's expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm. "Sarah, that sounds like you're planning some kind of revenge scheme. Whatever you're thinking about doing, please reconsider. Your family has treated you poorly, but destroying their wedding isn't going to heal those wounds or improve your relationship with them." Her assumption that I wanted to heal my relationship with my family revealed how much she still misunderstood my current emotional state. The Sarah who had spent years trying to earn her parents' love and acceptance was gone, replaced by someone who had finally acknowledged that some relationships were beyond repair, and that justice sometimes required consequences rather than forgiveness. "I'm not seeking revenge," I told her, allowing a small smile to play at the corners of my mouth. "I'm simply balancing the scales of justice. For too long, my family has operated under the assumption that they can treat me however they choose without any accountability or consequences. Tomorrow, they're going to discover that actions have results and that taking advantage of someone's generosity has limits." Rachel leaned forward across the small cafe table, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Listen to yourself, Sarah. You're talking like someone who's about to do something that can't be undone. Whatever your family has done to hurt you, ruining Jessica's wedding will make you look like the villain in this story. People won't see the years of mistreatment that led to this moment. They'll only see you destroying what should be the happiest day of your sister's life." Her concern was genuine and came from a place of caring, but it also demonstrated her fundamental misunderstanding of what justice looked like when years of diplomatic solutions had failed completely. Rachel believed in communication compromise and gradual relationship improvement because she came from a family where love was unconditional and conflicts could be resolved through honest conversation. She couldn't comprehend that some family dynamics were so toxic that the only healthy response was complete disengagement, backed by clear consequences. "Rachel, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the full scope of what's been happening," I said, my voice remaining calm despite her growing agitation. "This isn't about one wedding or one unreasonable request. This is about 34 years of systematic emotional and financial abuse that has been escalating rather than improving. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse to enable destructive behavior any longer." She stared at me for several long moments, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had changed in my perspective, but unable to pinpoint exactly what that transformation meant. "Promise me you'll think about this one more time before you do anything irreversible," she finally said. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it's something you can live with for the rest of your life." I promised her I would consider her advice, though we both understood that my mind was already made up. As we parted ways outside the cafe, Rachel gave me a longer hug than usual, and I sensed she was genuinely worried about what the next 24 hours might bring. Her concern was touching, but it also reinforced my realization that I was completely alone in understanding the necessity of what was about to happen. Walking back to my car, I felt the familiar weight of isolation that had characterized most of my important life decisions. Just as I had navigated my education career and home purchase without meaningful family support, I would handle this situation independently as well. The difference was that this time my solitude felt empowering rather than lonely. And then someone else began watching my every move. The person watching my movements turned out to be my cousin Amanda Williams, Jessica's maid of honor, and someone I had always considered one of the more reasonable members of my extended family. Amanda was 26, worked as a marketing coordinator for a small advertising firm, and had maintained what I believed was a genuine friendship with me, separate from the broader family dynamics that usually left me feeling isolated and misunderstood. Amanda called me Friday evening just as I was finishing my final preparations and double-checking the timeline for Saturday's events. Her voice carried the warm, conspiratorial tone she had always used when she wanted to discuss family drama or share gossip about our relatives' latest adventures and misadventures. "Sarah, I've been thinking about you all week." She began settling into what sounded like a comfortable phone conversation. "I know this whole wedding venue situation has been stressful, and I wanted to check in and see how you're really feeling about everything. I mean, it's pretty intense that they asked you to give up your house with such short notice." Her concern seemed genuine, and I found myself appreciating what felt like the first empathetic response I had received from any family member since the wedding crisis began. Amanda had always been more perceptive than most of our relatives, and her acknowledgement that the situation was unfair felt validating after days of being treated as if my accommodation was both expected and insufficient. "It's been challenging," I admitted, allowing a note of weariness to enter my voice. "I keep trying to focus on Jessica's happiness, but honestly, Amanda, sometimes I feel like my own comfort and feelings don't matter to anyone in this family. It's like I'm only valued for what I can provide, rather than who I am as a person." Amanda made sympathetic noises and encouraged me to elaborate on my feelings, asking specific questions about my conversations with my parents and my concerns about the weekend logistics. Her questions felt supportive and understanding, the kind of detailed interest that suggested she genuinely cared about my emotional well-being rather than simply gathering surface-level information. Over the course of our 40-minute conversation, I found myself sharing more than I had intended about my frustration with the family dynamics and my growing sense that I needed to establish better boundaries in my relationships with my parents and Jessica. Amanda listened attentively, offering validation and encouragement that felt like exactly what I needed to hear from someone who understood the family from the inside. "You know what, Sarah, I think you're handling this situation with incredible grace," she said near the end of our call. "A lot of people would have refused outright or made a huge scene about the short notice. The fact that you're prioritizing Jessica's happiness even when it's inconvenient for you shows what kind of person you really are." Her praise felt genuine and helped reinforce my sense that I was taking the high road in a difficult situation. When we ended the call, I felt more confident about my decision to allow the wedding to proceed at my villa, and Amanda had successfully positioned herself as my ally and confidant within the family structure. What I didn't realize until the next morning was that Amanda had called my mother immediately after our conversation ended, providing a detailed report of everything I had shared about my emotional state and my plans for the weekend. I discovered this betrayal entirely by accident when I arrived at my office early Saturday morning to pick up some files I needed for my hotel stay. As I was gathering my papers, my phone rang with a call from my mother, who apparently hadn't realized how early it was or considered that I might not be available for a lengthy conversation. When I answered, I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, along with what sounded like wedding preparation activity and multiple conversations happening simultaneously. "Sarah, honey, Amanda told us about your conversation last night," Mom said without any preamble or consideration for whether I might prefer privacy about my personal feelings. "She said you're feeling a little overwhelmed by everything, and we just wanted you to know how much we appreciate your sacrifice for Jessica's special day." The casual way she referenced my private conversation with Amanda hit me like a physical blow. I had trusted Amanda with my genuine feelings and concerns, believing that she was offering me emotional support during a difficult time. Instead, she had immediately reported our entire conversation to my parents, turning my moment of vulnerability into intelligence gathering for the family's benefit. "Amanda was so sweet to check on you," Jessica's voice called from the background. "She told us you're really committed to making sure everything goes perfectly today, and that you're not planning to cause any drama or complications. That's such a relief, Sarah." We were a little worried you might try to make the day about yourself somehow." The revelation that Amanda had been specifically tasked with assessing whether I might cause drama clarified the true purpose of her supportive phone call. My family had been concerned enough about my potential resistance to their plans that they had enlisted Amanda to gather intelligence about my emotional state and intentions for the wedding day. More disturbing was the realization that this surveillance suggested they had some awareness that their treatment of me might provoke a negative response. They understood on some level that asking me to surrender my home with a week's notice was unreasonable, and they were concerned enough about my potential reaction to monitor my behavior through a family member they knew I trusted. Rather than confronting Amanda or expressing my hurt about her betrayal, I decided to use this intelligence network to my advantage. If my family wanted information about my state of mind and intentions, I would provide exactly the information that would serve my purposes while maintaining my element of surprise. Over the next several hours, I began sending Amanda carefully crafted text messages designed to reinforce the impression that I was emotionally resigned to my role as the accommodating sister who would cause no trouble for Jessica's perfect day. I complained about feeling tired and overwhelmed, mentioned that I was looking forward to a quiet weekend at a hotel where I could rest and avoid any wedding stress, and expressed gratitude that the family was handling all the logistics so I wouldn't need to worry about details. Each message was calculated to suggest that I had fully accepted my exclusion from the wedding preparation and was seeking comfort in withdrawal rather than confrontation. I portrayed myself as someone who was emotionally drained by the situation, but committed to avoiding conflict rather than addressing the underlying issues that had created my distress. Amanda responded to each message with sympathy and encouragement, assuring me that I was making the right choice by prioritizing family harmony over my own feelings. Her responses confirmed that she was indeed reporting our conversations to my parents, as her language increasingly echoed the phrases and sentiments that my family typically used to manage my emotional reactions to their decisions. By mid-afternoon, I was confident that my parents and Jessica believed I had been effectively neutralized as a potential source of wedding day complications. Through Amanda's reports, they had received confirmation that I was emotionally defeated, physically absent, and committed to avoiding any actions that might disrupt Jessica's celebration. They had no idea that their own spy was leading them straight into my trap. With Amanda established as my unwitting conduit to the family's intelligence network, I began crafting a more elaborate deception designed to convince them that I was not only emotionally defeated, but also financially vulnerable, in ways that would make me completely dependent on their continued goodwill. The key was to present myself as someone whose circumstances had deteriorated to the point where I could no longer afford to challenge their decisions or risk losing their support. Saturday afternoon, as wedding preparations were reaching their peak at my villa, I called Amanda with what I presented as an urgent financial crisis that had been weighing on my mind for weeks. My voice carried the kind of barely controlled panic that suggested someone on the verge of a complete breakdown, and I allowed genuine emotion to creep into my tone as I described fictional problems that painted me as increasingly desperate and powerless. "Amanda, I need to talk to someone, and I don't know who else I can trust with this." I began setting the stage for revelations that would make their way directly to my parents within hours. "I've been trying to keep it together for Jessica's wedding, but honestly, I'm in serious financial trouble, and I don't know what I'm going to do." I proceeded to outline a carefully constructed story about unexpected expenses and cash flow problems that had supposedly been building for months. I explained that my company had implemented budget cuts that reduced my expected bonus, that my villa's property taxes had increased dramatically due to a reassessment, and that I had discovered several major home repairs that would require immediate attention and substantial financial investment. The pool renovation I mentioned, it's not optional anymore, I told Amanda, allowing my voice to crack with what sounded like genuine distress. The inspection revealed structural problems that could cause serious damage if they're not addressed immediately. I'm looking at over $50,000 in emergency repairs, and I just don't have that kind of money available right now. Amanda made appropriate, sympathetic noises while I continued building the fiction of my financial desperation. I described having to consider selling the villa, possibly taking a second mortgage, or even moving back in with my parents temporarily while I sorted out my money problems. Each detail was designed to reinforce the impression that I was facing a crisis that would make me more dependent on family support, rather than less. The worst part is that I can't even ask the family for help because everyone's focused on Jessica's wedding, and I don't want to burden anyone with my problems during such an important time. I continued creating the perfect excuse for why my fictional crisis would remain secret, while establishing myself as someone too considerate and defeated to cause any disruption. I could hear Amanda taking mental notes as I elaborated on my supposed difficulties, and I knew she was already planning how to relay this information to my parents in a way that would maximize their sense of relief about my neutralized state. The story I was telling positioned me as someone so overwhelmed by personal problems that I had no energy or resources left to challenge their decisions about the wedding or anything else. "Sarah, I had no idea you were dealing with all of this," Amanda said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern, mixed with the satisfaction of someone who had stumbled upon valuable intelligence. "It explains why you've seemed so tired and distracted lately. Are you sure you don't want me to mention anything to your parents? They might be able to help, especially your dad with his business connections." I declined her offer with what I hoped sounded like pride, mixed with resignation, explaining that I needed to handle my problems independently and didn't want to create additional stress for the family during Jessica's special time. This response would serve multiple purposes when Amanda reported it, demonstrating both my continued isolation from family support systems and my commitment to avoiding any actions that might disrupt their celebration. By evening, the effects of Amanda's intelligence gathering were evident in the increasingly casual and dismissive way my family communicated with me. Jessica sent me a brief text thanking me for making everything possible, but including no details about timing logistics or any consideration for my convenience during the transition. My parents called to confirm key arrangements, but spoke to me with the kind of patronizing kindness typically reserved for elderly relatives or children who needed gentle management. "We really appreciate everything you're doing for Jessica," Dad said during our final coordination call, his tone carrying an undertone of satisfaction that suggested he felt completely confident about his control over the situation. "This kind of family support is exactly what makes these occasions so special. Jessica is absolutely glowing with happiness." In the background, I could hear Jessica's laughter and excited conversation with what sounded like several friends who had arrived early to help with preparations. Her voice carried the kind of carefree joy that belonged to someone who had never doubted that the world would arrange itself around her convenience and who had received confirmation that even potential obstacles would dissolve without requiring any effort or compromise on her part. "Sarah's been so understanding about everything." Jessica's voice drifted closer to the phone. "Amanda told us she's dealing with some personal stuff right now, so it's actually perfect that she won't be around to stress about details or try to micromanage anything. We can just focus on making everything beautiful without worrying about anyone's feelings getting hurt." The casual cruelty of her assessment, delivered within my hearing, confirmed that my family now viewed me as completely harmless and entirely under their control. They believed that my fictional financial crisis had broken whatever resistance I might have mounted to their plans, and that my accommodation of their demands represented permanent acceptance of my subordinate role in family dynamics. Mom's voice joined the conversation with maternal warmth that felt particularly hollow given the context. "It's wonderful when family can come together like this during important moments. Sarah's generosity is really making Jessica's dream wedding possible, and we're all so grateful for her sacrifice." Their gratitude felt like the final insult, confirming that they viewed my surrender of my home as a sacrifice I should be honored to make rather than an imposition they should feel guilty about requesting. They had successfully convinced themselves that I was not only willing but grateful to provide whatever resources they needed while expecting nothing in return, except their brief acknowledgement of my usefulness. As I listened to their satisfied planning and celebration, I felt a cold clarity settle over me that erased any remaining doubts about what I was about to do. Their complete confidence in my defeat and their casual discussion of my problems as convenient solutions to their logistics confirmed that they had never seen me as a person worthy of consideration or respect. While they were laughing, I was counting every second on the clock. The precision of my timing calculations had revealed an opportunity that extended far beyond simple family revenge into the realm of public accountability and social consequences that would resonate throughout our community for years to come. As I sat in my hotel room Friday night reviewing the guest list Jessica had proudly shared with extended family members, I realized that her desire for a high-profile celebration had created the perfect stage for a much more dramatic performance than she had ever imagined. Jessica's guest list read like a directory of Malibu's social elite, including prominent business leaders, influential community members, and several families whose names appeared regularly in local society columns and charity event coverage. She had spent months cultivating relationships with these connections, viewing her wedding as an opportunity to establish herself and Michael as serious players in the community's social hierarchy rather than simply celebrating their commitment to each other. Using the information I had gathered about her guest list and wedding timeline, I began crafting additional invitations that would expand the audience for Saturday's events in ways that would transform a private family celebration into a very public examination of character and consequences. These supplementary invitations were not intended to increase the guest count for Jessica's party, but rather to ensure that appropriate witnesses would be present when the true nature of my family's behavior became impossible to ignore. My first set of carefully worded communications went to 3 local news reporters who specialized in community interest stories and social events coverage. I contacted Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times, David Chen from the coastal lifestyle magazine Pacific Shores, and Rebecca Thompson from the community blog that covered local social events and business networking occasions. Each invitation was crafted to suggest that they had been recommended by mutual acquaintances who thought they might be interested in covering what was being described as one of the most elaborate wedding celebrations of the year. Jessica Thompson Rodriguez's oceanfront wedding promises to be a stunning celebration of love and community. I wrote providing details about the villa's prime location and the distinguished guest list that would be attending. The bride's family has spared no expense in creating what they describe as the social event of the season, featuring some of Malibu's most prominent residents and business leaders. I included enough specific details about the venue timing and expected attendees to make the event sound legitimate and newsworthy, while carefully avoiding any information that might allow them to verify their invitations directly with Jessica or her family. The journalists would arrive expecting to cover a society wedding and instead would witness something far more dramatic and socially significant. My second round of strategic invitations targeted several local political figures and community leaders whose presence would add weight and legitimacy to whatever events unfolded on Saturday. I sent carefully worded communications to City Councilwoman Margaret Foster, who had a reputation for advocating for consumer protection and ethical business practices, and to County Supervisor James Whitman, whose office frequently dealt with property disputes and family legal matters. These invitations were presented as opportunities to network with prominent community members at an exclusive social gathering with the suggestion that their presence would be welcomed by the host family, who valued their public service and community leadership. I provided enough background information about the guest list and venue to make attendance seem professionally beneficial while maintaining the same careful vagueness about verification that I had used with the media contacts. The most delicate invitation went to Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the Malibu Sheriff's Department, whom I had researched through public records and community involvement databases. Detective Kim specialized in financial crimes and domestic disputes and had received several community awards for her work helping families navigate complex legal situations involving property and inheritance issues. I crafted her invitation as a personal recommendation from a mutual professional contact suggesting that she might enjoy networking with other community leaders at what was being described as a celebration of family values and community support. The invitation carefully mentioned that several prominent business leaders would be discussing community safety initiatives and family support programs, topics that aligned with her professional interests and community involvement. Each invitation included subtle details that would make the recipients feel that their attendance was both welcome and potentially beneficial for their professional or personal interests. I provided enough information about timing, location, and expected attendees to make the event sound legitimate and worth their time, while avoiding any specifics that might prompt them to contact Jessica or her family for verification. The beauty of this approach was that Jessica had been so focused on impressing her confirmed guest list that she had made no arrangements for managing unexpected arrivals or verifying invitation authenticity. Her wedding planner had been instructed to accommodate anyone who appeared to belong at such an exclusive gathering, and the assumption was that only appropriate people would have access to the venue information and timing details. Meanwhile, my family continued their preparations in complete ignorance of the expanded audience that would be witnessing Saturday's events. Jessica posted enthusiastic social media updates about her perfect wedding venue and dream celebration, while my parents shared proud comments about hosting the social event of the year at their daughter's stunning oceanfront location. Their confidence and excitement were particularly striking, given how little they understood about what kind of social event they were actually about to host. They viewed Saturday as an opportunity to showcase their family's success and social connections, never imagining that they were about to provide a very different kind of demonstration for a much more significant audience than they had planned. The irony was that Jessica had genuinely wanted her wedding to be talked about throughout the community for years to come, and my additional invitations would certainly ensure that her wish came true, though not in the way she had envisioned when she first dreamed of her perfect celebration. That day wouldn't just have wedding guests, but witnesses to justice and accountability. The final 24 hours before Jessica's wedding required a performance of helpfulness and family loyalty that tested every acting skill I had developed over 34 years of managing my family's expectations while protecting my own emotional survival. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect California weather that seemed designed to mock the chaos I was about to unleash, and I drove to my villa one last time under the pretense of ensuring everything was ready for Jessica's perfect day. When I arrived at 8 in the morning, the property was already bustling with activity that felt both familiar and surreal. Jessica's wedding planner, a efficiently organized woman named Clarissa, who commanded vendors with military precision, had transformed my peaceful sanctuary into a staging ground for what she clearly viewed as the social event of her professional career. Florists were arranging elaborate bouquets throughout the garden areas, caterers were setting up preparation stations in my kitchen, and a small army of decorators was hanging lights and fabric throughout the outdoor spaces. Jessica herself was holding court near the pool area, directing traffic with the kind of confident authority that came from never doubting that everyone around her existed primarily to serve her vision. She wore a flowing white robe over her pajamas and had her hair in curlers, but her voice carried clearly across the property as she issued instructions and corrections to vendors who were working to transform my home into her fantasy wedding venue. "The flowers need to be higher on that trellis," she called to the florists, pointing at an arrangement that looked perfectly adequate to my untrained eye. "And make sure the lighting creates the right ambiance for photos. This is going to be featured in magazines, so everything has to be absolutely flawless." When she noticed my arrival, Jessica's expression shifted to the kind of patronizing gratitude that suggested she viewed my presence as both unnecessary and potentially disruptive to her carefully orchestrated morning. "Sarah, you're here early. I thought you'd want to sleep in at your hotel before everything gets crazy busy." Her tone carried the clear implication that my hotel stay was not just convenient for her preparations, but preferable for everyone involved, since my presence at my own property might somehow interfere with her ability to create her perfect wedding atmosphere. The casual way she dismissed my right to be in my own home while accepting my sacrifice as her due demonstrated exactly the kind of entitled thinking that had characterized our relationship for decades. "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need," I replied, maintaining the helpful, accommodating tone that had served me well throughout this deception. Is there anything I can do to help with the preparations, or should I just stay out of everyone's way? Jessica considered my offer with the kind of calculation that suggested she was weighing the potential usefulness of my assistance against the risk that I might somehow diminish the perfection of her day by inserting myself into activities that didn't really require my participation. Actually, you could help by making sure all your personal items are completely out of sight, she said, gesturing toward the house with proprietary confidence. I don't want any of your stuff visible in the background of photos, and some of the vendors need clear access to storage areas. It would be great if you could just do a final sweep and remove anything that might look cluttered or personal. The request to erase all evidence of my presence from my own home felt like the perfect metaphor for my role in the family dynamics, and I agreed immediately while privately noting the irony that Jessica was asking me to make my house look as if I had never lived there. I spent the next hour moving personal photographs, books, and decorative items into closets and cabinets, creating the sterile, impersonal environment that Jessica apparently needed for her fantasy celebration. Throughout the morning, Jessica maintained a running commentary about the wedding preparations that included frequent observations about my helpfulness and her gratitude for my accommodation, but delivered in a tone that suggested she was performing generosity rather than feeling it genuinely. Sarah's been so understanding about letting us take over her house, she told the wedding planner, her voice carrying enough volume to ensure I could hear her performance of sisterly appreciation. I mean, it's not like she had any major plans for the weekend anyway, and family should always come first during important celebrations like this. Her casual dismissal of the possibility that I might have had my own plans for my own home was delivered with such confident certainty that even the wedding planner looked slightly uncomfortable with the implication that my weekend was inherently less valuable than Jessica's celebration requirements. Later, while I was helping arrange chairs in the garden area, Jessica approached me with the kind of conspiratorial intimacy that suggested she wanted to share something she viewed as particularly amusing or satisfying. You know, Sarah, I have to admit that when we first asked about using your villa, I was worried you might make this difficult somehow, she said, her voice carrying genuine relief mixed with what sounded like mild surprise. But you've been so cooperative and understanding. It's almost like you finally figured out how to be a good sister. The backhanded compliment delivered as if my accommodation represented character growth rather than strategic planning demonstrated her complete confidence that she had successfully established permanent dominance in our relationship. She genuinely believed that my compliance represented acceptance of my subordinate role rather than preparation for consequences she couldn't imagine. Amanda mentioned that you're dealing with some financial stress right now. Jessica continued, her tone shifting to what she probably thought was sympathetic understanding. I'm sure it feels good to focus on something positive like family celebration instead of worrying about money problems. Sometimes helping other people is the best way to forget your own troubles. Her casual reference to my fictional financial crisis delivered as if my problems were common knowledge rather than private information shared in confidence confirmed that Amanda had indeed reported every detail of our conversations to the family. More revealing was Jessica's assumption that my troubles were somehow therapeutic entertainment rather than genuine difficulties that might deserve empathy or assistance. The only family member who seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamics was my 79-year-old grandmother, Dorothy Thompson, who arrived around noon to help with final preparations, but spent most of her time observing the interactions between family members with the kind of sharp attention that came from decades of reading people and situations. Grandmother had always been more perceptive than the rest of the family about emotional undercurrents and unspoken tensions, and I noticed her watching me with particular intensity as I moved through the wedding preparations with what probably appeared to be unusual calm and focus. "Sarah, honey, can I talk to you privately for a moment?" she asked, approaching me while I was arranging programs on a table near the ceremony area. Her voice carried the kind of gentle concern that suggested she had detected something in my demeanor that worried her, though she couldn't quite identify what had triggered her unease. We walked toward the edge of the property, away from the busy preparation areas, and grandmother studied my face with the kind of scrutiny that had always made me feel like she could see directly into my thoughts and motivations. "There's something different about you today," she said, her voice quiet but direct. "You seem too calm, too accommodating even for you. I've been watching this family treat you poorly for years, and today feels like something's building toward a breaking point. Are you planning something that might hurt people, including yourself?" Her question caught me off guard because it demonstrated a level of awareness about family dynamics that I hadn't expected anyone to possess, and because it suggested she understood that my current behavior represented a departure from my usual patterns rather than simply my continued accommodation of family demands. "Grandmother, I'm just trying to make sure Jessica has a beautiful wedding day," I said, choosing my words carefully while maintaining eye contact to project sincerity. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that I've thought carefully about my choices and their consequences." She continued studying my expression for several long moments, clearly recognizing that my response had been diplomatic rather than reassuring, and that my mention of consequences suggested I was anticipating outcomes that extended beyond simple wedding logistics. "Sarah, I've lived long enough to recognize when someone has reached their limit," she said finally. "Whatever you're planning, please remember that some actions can't be undone, and that revenge often hurts the person seeking it more than the people who deserve it." Her warning was delivered with genuine love and concern, but it also revealed her assumption that my plans were motivated by revenge rather than justice, and that my goal was to hurt my family rather than simply establish appropriate consequences for their behavior. I appreciated her care, while recognizing that she couldn't understand the full scope of what they had done or the necessity of what was about to happen. I just smiled because that day had arrived. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, my family had become so absorbed in the final wedding preparations that my presence had shifted from temporarily useful to completely forgotten, exactly as I had anticipated when I planned the timing of my strategic withdrawal from their activities. Jessica was sequestered in one of my guest bedrooms with her bridesmaids transforming herself into the bride she had been envisioning for months, while my parents coordinated with vendors and managed the countless details that seemed to multiply exponentially as the ceremony time approached. The atmosphere around the villa had reached a fever pitch of organized chaos that felt both impressive and slightly overwhelming to observe from my position as an increasingly invisible participant in my own property's transformation. Clarissa, the wedding planner, moved through the space with military efficiency, checking items off elaborate lists while directing an army of photographers, musicians, and catering staff who had arrived to create what everyone seemed confident would be a flawless celebration. I made my final exit from the wedding preparations around 4 o'clock, explaining to my mother that I needed to gather my remaining personal items and head to my hotel to get ready for the evening festivities. My departure generated only the most perfunctory acknowledgement from family members who were too focused on their own preparations to register my movements as anything more than background logistics. "Have a good time getting ready, honey," Mom called from the kitchen where she was consulting with the head caterer about timing for the dinner service. "We'll see you at the ceremony. Try to get there a little early so you can find a good seat before all the important guests arrive." Her casual instruction to arrive early for a good seat at my own property perfectly captured the family's complete absorption in their own importance, while treating my presence as optional and potentially inconvenient, if not properly managed. The fact that she referred to other attendees as important guests, while clearly categorizing me as someone who needed to compete for seating, revealed exactly how thoroughly they had reorganized the social hierarchy around Jessica's celebration. I drove away from my villa for what I knew would be the last time as someone who could be taken for granted by my family, and spent the next 2 hours at my hotel reviewing every detail of the timeline that would begin unfolding in less than 60 minutes. My construction crews were positioned and ready, my legal documentation was complete, and my additional invited witnesses would be arriving at the villa shortly after the scheduled ceremony start time. At 6:30, exactly 30 minutes before Jessica's wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin, I drove back toward my property to observe the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation. Rather than parking in my usual driveway, I positioned my car at a scenic overlook about half a mile from the villa, where I could use binoculars to watch the evening's events unfold without being seen by any of the participants. The view from my observation point provided a perfect panoramic perspective of my property and the surrounding coastal area, allowing me to monitor both the wedding activities and the arrival of guests while remaining completely removed from the social dynamics that were about to explode in ways none of them could anticipate. From my elevated vantage point, I could see that the villa and its surrounding grounds had been transformed into exactly the kind of elegant celebration venue that Jessica had been dreaming about for months. White fabric and twinkling lights created an atmosphere of romantic sophistication throughout the garden areas, while the ocean backdrop provided the kind of stunning natural beauty that would have made any photographer excited about capturing memorable images. The guest parking area was filling rapidly with expensive cars that reflected the social status of attendees who represented some of Malibu's most prominent families and business leaders. I watched well-dressed couples emerge from luxury vehicles and make their way toward what they expected to be an exclusive celebration of love and community connection, completely unaware that they were about to witness something far more dramatic and socially significant. Through my binoculars, I could observe the arrival of several faces I recognized from my strategic invitation list, including the journalists and community leaders whose presence would transform whatever happened next from a private family matter into a public examination of character and consequences. Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times appeared to be taking preliminary photographs of the venue, while Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim was engaging in what looked like casual conversation with other early arrivals. Most satisfying was watching my family move through their final preparations with the kind of confident excitement that belonged to people who believed they had successfully orchestrated the social event of their dreams while completely controlling all variables that might affect their celebration. Jessica emerged from the villa in her wedding dress looking absolutely radiant, surrounded by bridesmaids who were clearly thrilled to be part of such an elegant and high-profile occasion. My parents appeared to be in their element as they greeted arriving guests and basked in the social recognition that came from hosting what everyone seemed to agree was a spectacular celebration. Dad was wearing his most expensive suit and engaging in animated conversations with business associates, while Mom moved gracefully through the crowd in a role that seemed to fulfill every fantasy she had ever harbored about being the mother of the bride at a society wedding. Michael the groom looked appropriately handsome and nervous as he took his position for the ceremony, surrounded by groomsmen and family members who all seemed genuinely excited about the celebration they were about to witness. The entire scene radiated the kind of joy and anticipation that belonged to people who had never doubted that their special day would unfold exactly as they had planned and deserved. At exactly 7 o'clock, as guests began taking their seats for the ceremony, and Jessica prepared to make her grand entrance as the bride she had always envisioned herself becoming, I watched the wedding planner check her watch and signal to the musicians that it was time to begin the processional music that would mark the official start of Jessica's perfect wedding celebration. And then the villa gates remained firmly locked shut. The confusion that had begun as isolated incidents of guests arriving to find locked gates escalated into genuine crisis as the stream of arrivals became a flood of increasingly frustrated and bewildered attendees who found themselves trapped outside what should have been the most exclusive celebration of the season. From my elevated observation point, I watched through binoculars as luxury vehicles continued arriving in steady succession, their occupants emerging in formal evening wear, only to discover that the elaborate wedding they had been invited to attend was apparently inaccessible for reasons no one could explain or resolve. The initial trickle of confused guests had grown into a substantial crowd of nearly 200 people clustered around the villa's main entrance, their expensive gowns and tailored suits creating a surreal contrast with their obvious distress and growing irritation about the unprecedented situation they were experiencing. The parking situation along the narrow coastal road had become chaotic as arriving vehicles searched for space, while departing cars began creating traffic problems that would soon attract attention from local authorities who monitored the area for exactly these kinds of disruptions to residential tranquility. Through my binoculars, I could observe the social dynamics unfolding among guests who represented some of Malibu's most prominent families and business leaders, people who were unaccustomed to being inconvenienced or kept waiting for explanations about situations that appeared to be beyond anyone's control. The conversations I could observe through body language and facial expressions ranged from polite concern to obvious annoyance, with some guests already pulling out their phones to share their confusion on social media platforms or contact other attendees to verify that they had correct information about timing and location. The guest list that Jessica had so carefully cultivated to represent the pinnacle of local social hierarchy was now working against her in spectacular fashion, as influential community members found themselves standing outside locked gates, while wedding preparations that had been in progress for hours remained completely inaccessible to the very people who were supposed to be celebrating and witnessing the ceremony. The irony of having assembled exactly the audience Jessica had wanted to impress, only to have them witness her complete inability to manage the basic logistics of hosting them, was becoming more apparent with each passing minute. Among the growing crowd of frustrated attendees, I could identify several of the strategic additions I had made to the invitation list, including journalists and community leaders, whose presence would ensure that whatever was unfolding would be documented and discussed throughout the region long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times was already taking photographs of the locked gates and gathering crowd while other guests were sharing their bewilderment through social media posts that would soon spread far beyond the people who were physically present at the villa. Inside the villa grounds, I could see my family beginning to comprehend that something was fundamentally wrong with their carefully orchestrated celebration, though their initial response seemed to focus on technical problems rather than the possibility that they were facing deliberate obstruction. Jessica appeared first near the main house, still wearing her wedding dress, but now displaying obvious panic as she looked toward the entrance where her guests should have been streaming in for the ceremony that was already running significantly behind schedule. The sight of Jessica in her elaborate bridal gown standing helplessly inside the villa, while 200 formally dressed guests remained locked outside, created exactly the kind of visual contradiction that would be remembered and discussed throughout the community for years to come. Her investment in creating the perfect wedding celebration was being undermined by circumstances that appeared to be completely beyond her control, transforming what should have been her moment of social triumph into a public relations disaster that was being documented in real time. My parents emerged from the villa shortly after Jessica, moving with the kind of urgent determination that suggested they were attempting to solve what they assumed was a temporary technical malfunction before it became a complete catastrophe. I watched Dad approach the gate controls with obvious confusion, apparently discovering that the electronic systems that should have allowed them to welcome their guests were not responding to the usual access codes or remote controls that had always functioned reliably in the past. The first phone call to my cell phone came at exactly 7:20 with Dad's contact information appearing on my screen as I sat in my car observing the escalating chaos below. I allowed the call to transfer directly to voicemail without any consideration of answering, then immediately received a second call from Mom's phone, which I also declined to acknowledge. The pattern continued with increasing frequency and obvious desperation as different family members took turns attempting to reach me, their calls becoming more urgent as the situation at the villa deteriorated beyond anything they had anticipated or prepared to handle. The voicemails they were leaving escalated rapidly from confused requests for technical assistance to angry demands that I immediately resolve whatever problem was preventing their guests from accessing the property. Jessica's messages, in particular, carried the kind of panicked fury that belonged to someone watching their most important day dissolve into public humiliation through circumstances they couldn't understand, control, or explain to the influential people who were witnessing their complete helplessness. Sarah, I don't know what kind of technical problem you're having with your security system, but you need to get over here immediately and fix whatever is wrong. Jessica's third voicemail began, her voice cracking with stress and barely controlled hysteria. We have 200 of the most important people in Malibu standing outside your gates, and this is supposed to be my wedding day. I don't care what you're doing or where you are right now, you need to drop everything and solve this crisis before it completely destroys everything we've worked for. The evolution of her tone from confused plea to entitled demand perfectly captured the family dynamic that had motivated everything I was now watching unfold with such satisfaction. Even in the midst of complete crisis, Jessica's first instinct remained to treat me as someone whose primary purpose was solving problems that interfered with her comfort and happiness, regardless of my own circumstances' availability or willingness to provide assistance on her timeline and terms. Dad's voicemails reflected a different kind of desperation focused primarily on the social embarrassment of having prominent community members standing outside, while the hosting family appeared completely unable to manage the basic responsibilities of welcoming their invited guests. "Sarah, this situation is becoming a serious problem that's affecting our family's reputation throughout the community." His voice conveyed genuine panic beneath his attempt to maintain paternal authority. "We have the mayor's wife standing out there along with 3 city council members and some very important business associates. This is making our entire family look incompetent and unreliable, and we need you to resolve it immediately before the damage becomes permanent." Mom's messages revealed her growing awareness that the situation was moving beyond simple technical difficulties into something that could permanently damage their standing within the social circles they had spent years cultivating through careful relationship building and community involvement. "Honey, please call us back right now because people are starting to leave and Jessica is having a complete emotional breakdown. Whatever's wrong with your gate system, we'll figure out how to pay for emergency repairs later, but right now, we just need to get everyone inside before this becomes a total disaster that follows us for years." From my observation point, I could see that their assessment of the situation as a potential total disaster was entirely accurate, as the crowd outside the gates was indeed beginning to thin as guests made individual decisions about how long they were willing to wait for a celebration that showed no signs of actually beginning. Several cars had already departed from the improvised parking area, their occupants apparently concluding that whatever social obligation had brought them to the villa was outweighed by the obvious fact that no wedding ceremony would be taking place as advertised. The social media activity surrounding the locked gate situation was accelerating as guests shared their confusion and growing frustration with increasingly wide circles of followers, creating real-time documentation of my family's humiliation that would reach far beyond the people who were physically present at the villa. The posts ranged from mildly amused observations about wedding planning disasters to more pointed commentary about the apparent incompetence of hosts who couldn't manage to provide access to their own celebration. The most satisfying aspect of watching the situation develop was observing how my family's panic was intensifying as they realized that their perfect wedding was transforming into a community-wide story about their inability to manage basic hosting responsibilities with influential witnesses who would carry accounts of their incompetence throughout their professional and social networks for months or possibly years to come. Inside the villa, I could see Jessica's emotional state deteriorating rapidly as she moved frantically between different areas of the property, clearly searching for solutions to a problem that had no immediate resolution, while still wearing her wedding dress and maintaining the pretense that her celebration might somehow be salvaged. Her desperation was genuine, and increasingly visible to the guests who could observe her through the locked gates, adding personal humiliation to the logistical failure that was destroying her social reputation. By 8 o'clock, exactly 1 hour after the ceremony should have begun, the situation had deteriorated to the point where even the most patient and socially gracious guests were expressing serious irritation about the delay and lack of communication from the hosting family. The remaining crowd outside the gates had diminished considerably as people reached their individual limits for tolerating uncertainty and inconvenience, though those who stayed were primarily the ones most likely to share detailed accounts of the unprecedented situation throughout their own social and professional networks. Then the sound of heavy construction equipment filled the air. The rumble of diesel engines that had been building in the distance suddenly became immediate and overwhelming as coastal construction and landscaping's convoy materialized around the bend in the coastal road, their arrival timed with the precision that Maria Santos had promised, when we finalized the contracts for what appeared to the gathering crowd to be an emergency renovation project requiring immediate implementation. The lead truck, displaying official company signage and permit numbers that would satisfy any scrutiny from local authorities, was followed by 2 excavators, a concrete mixer, and several smaller vehicles carrying construction workers, who emerged wearing hard hats and safety vests that established their legitimate authority over the property. The immediate impact on the crowd of stranded wedding guests was dramatic and disorienting, as people who had been focused on gaining access to a social celebration suddenly found themselves witnessing the arrival of heavy industrial equipment that transformed the entire nature of their situation from delayed party to active construction zone with legal restrictions that would make their continued presence both inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The shift in atmosphere was palpable as formally dressed attendees began stepping back from the roadway to avoid the massive vehicles that were maneuvering into position around the villa's perimeter. Maria Santos emerged from the lead truck with the kind of professional confidence that immediately commanded attention and respect from everyone present. Her clipboard of official documentation and authoritative demeanor, making it clear that she was someone who dealt regularly with complex property emergencies and understood exactly how to manage situations where construction needs took precedence over other scheduled activities. Her safety vest and hard hat were not costume pieces, but legitimate professional equipment that reinforced her legal authority to control access to what was now officially designated as an active work site. Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to clear this area immediately for safety reasons, Maria announced in a voice that carried clearly over the murmur of confused conversations and the mechanical sounds of construction equipment being positioned. We have emergency permits for pool renovation and structural repairs that require immediate attention due to safety compliance issues, and this entire property is now designated as a restricted construction zone with no public access permitted under city regulations. The authority with which she delivered this announcement, combined with the obvious legitimacy of the construction permits she was displaying, created an immediate shift in how the gathered guests understood their situation. They were no longer simply experiencing a delayed wedding celebration, but were being officially excluded from property that had become subject to emergency safety restrictions that took legal precedence over any social events that might have been previously scheduled. The reaction from the remaining guests was a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple venue malfunction or family miscommunication. The presence of legitimate construction equipment and official permits made it impossible to dismiss the situation as a temporary delay that might be resolved through patience or negotiation, as people began processing the implications of being told that the property was now legally inaccessible for safety reasons. From inside the villa grounds, I could observe my family's response to the construction crew's arrival through my binoculars, and their expressions of complete shock and disbelief were everything I had hoped to achieve when I planned this moment of revelation. Jessica, still wearing her wedding dress, was standing near the main house with her mouth literally open as she watched heavy machinery being positioned around the property that she had assumed was completely under her control for the weekend. Dad's reaction was more immediate and aggressive as he rushed toward the villa's main gate to confront Maria about what he clearly believed was some kind of catastrophic mistake that could be quickly resolved through explanation and possibly financial incentive. I watched him gesticulating frantically, while attempting to speak with Maria through the locked entrance, his body language conveying the kind of desperate urgency that belonged to someone watching their carefully constructed social facade crumble in front of the very people they had been trying to impress. The construction workers moved with impressive efficiency to establish official safety barriers and warning signs around the entire property perimeter, their professional coordination and legitimate equipment making it impossible for anyone to challenge the legality of their presence or question their authority to restrict access to what was now officially designated as an active work site. The barriers were not temporary decorations, but substantial safety installations that met all city requirements for protecting public access to construction zones. The most psychologically devastating aspect of watching the construction crew's arrival was observing how it transformed my family, from confident hosts of an exclusive celebration into helpless bystanders who had lost complete control over their own event while being unable to explain or resolve the situation for their increasingly frustrated and bewildered guests. The power dynamic that had characterized our family relationships for decades was being publicly reversed as I demonstrated complete authority over circumstances they had assumed they could manipulate. Several of the prominent guests I could identify through my binoculars were beginning to document the unprecedented situation through photographs and videos that would soon appear on social media platforms throughout the community. Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times was taking professional quality images of the construction signs and safety barriers, while other attendees were capturing the obvious distress of the wedding family who remained trapped inside the villa grounds, while their celebration disintegrated in real time. The social media documentation was particularly satisfying to observe as guests began sharing photos of construction equipment, with captions that ranged from sympathetic commentary about wedding disasters to more pointed observations about the apparent deception involved in inviting people to a celebration at a venue that was apparently subject to emergency safety restrictions. The hashtags that Jessica had promoted extensively in advance of her wedding were now being used to share images of industrial barriers and confused crowds rather than elegant celebration photos. County Supervisor James Whitman's presence among the documented witnesses added governmental legitimacy to the proceedings, as his professional background would make him naturally inclined to verify the authenticity of the construction permits and safety restrictions being implemented. His involvement would ensure that any subsequent questions about the legality of the work would be answered by someone with direct knowledge of municipal permit processes and emergency safety protocols. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim was engaging in what appeared to be professional consultation with Maria Santos about the documentation and permits that authorized the construction work. Her law enforcement background, making her automatically suspicious of any situation that might involve fraud or deception. Her examination of the paperwork would provide independent verification that everything unfolding was completely legal and properly authorized through appropriate municipal channels. The departure of additional guests accelerated as people realized that the construction activity was not a temporary inconvenience that might be quickly resolved, but a legitimate safety restriction that would prevent any wedding celebration from proceeding as scheduled. The parking area that had been full of luxury vehicles was now rapidly emptying as attendees made practical decisions about how to spend their Saturday evening rather than continuing to wait for an event that clearly would not be taking place. Mom's emotional breakdown was becoming visible even from my distant observation point as she moved frantically between different areas of the villa grounds, while still wearing her elegant mother-of-the-bride outfit that now seemed grotesquely inappropriate for the industrial chaos that was systematically destroying her daughter's perfect celebration. Her attempts to maintain gracious host behavior toward the remaining guests were obviously futile, given that she had no control over the circumstances that were preventing the wedding from proceeding. The construction crew's systematic establishment of the worksite included positioning excavators near the pool area that was clearly visible from the main entrance, creating obvious justification for the safety restrictions that were preventing public access to the property. The heavy equipment was not merely decorative but represented legitimate renovation work that had been properly planned and permitted through all appropriate municipal channels. The irony of Jessica's situation was becoming increasingly apparent as she remained trapped inside the villa wearing her wedding dress, while the celebration she had spent months planning was being systematically dismantled by circumstances that appeared to be completely beyond her family's control or understanding. Her investment in creating the perfect social event was being undermined by forces that had never been subject to her influence or manipulation. The contrast between the construction workers' calm professionalism and my family's obvious panic created a visual representation of competence versus chaos that was being captured and shared by multiple witnesses who would ensure that the story spread throughout the community long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The documentation would create a permanent record of the evening when the Thompson family's social pretensions were publicly exposed and systematically destroyed. But the biggest shock was still waiting inside the villa. The arrival of James Morrison, my attorney, at exactly 9 o'clock, provided the final legal component that would transform the evening from chaotic wedding disaster into documented case of family fraud and deception. James emerged from his sedan carrying a briefcase and official documents, his professional appearance and obvious legal authority immediately drawing attention from the remaining guests, who were still gathered outside the villa gates, trying to understand what had happened to Jessica's celebration. James approached the crowd with the kind of measured confidence that belonged to someone delivering information that would clarify a complex situation, though not necessarily in ways that would be welcome to all parties involved. He positioned himself near the main gate, where his voice would carry clearly to the assembled guests, many of whom were still recording the unfolding events on their phones and sharing updates on social media platforms. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm James Morrison, attorney for Sarah Michelle Thompson, the sole legal owner of this property." He announced, his voice carrying the formal authority that came from years of delivering legal pronouncements in challenging circumstances. "I've been asked to clarify the legal status of this evening's events for everyone who has been affected by the confusion regarding venue access." The immediate attention his announcement received from the remaining guests was complete and focused as people realized they were about to receive official information that would explain the unprecedented situation they had been witnessing. Several guests moved closer to the gate to ensure they could hear every detail of what promised to be significant legal revelations about the property ownership and event authorization. This property, including the main residence and all grounds, is owned exclusively by Ms. Sarah Thompson, with no co-owners' liens or legal claims from any other parties. James continued, consulting his documents while speaking with the kind of precision that left no room for misinterpretation. "Ms. Thompson has not signed any contracts, agreements, or authorizations permitting the use of this property for wedding celebrations or any other events." The impact of his words on the assembled crowd was immediate and dramatic as guests began processing the implications of what they were hearing and realizing that they had been invited to an event that the property owner had never actually authorized. Murmurs of confusion and growing anger rippled through the group as people understood that they had been deceived about the basic legitimacy of the celebration they had been asked to attend. "Furthermore," James continued, "no rental agreements, event contracts, or venue authorizations exist between Ms. Thompson and any members of the Thompson family or their representatives. The invitation and scheduling of this evening's celebration appears to have been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the property owner." Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times was documenting every word of James's announcement while taking photographs that would accompany what was clearly becoming a significant news story about family fraud and event deception involving some of Malibu's most prominent residents. Her professional attention to the legal details ensured that the story would be reported accurately and with appropriate legal context. The reaction from inside the villa was visible even from my distant observation point as my family members gathered near the gate to hear James's pronouncements and began displaying the kind of shock and panic that came from watching their carefully constructed deception exposed in front of the very people they had been trying to impress. Jessica's wedding dress seemed almost grotesque in the context of what was being revealed about the fraudulent nature of her celebration. Any guests who incurred expenses related to attending this unauthorized event may wish to consult with legal counsel regarding potential recovery of costs from the parties responsible for the deceptive invitations. James added, providing information that would have immediate practical implications for many of the attendees who had spent significant money on formal wear gifts and travel arrangements for what they now understood had been a fraudulent celebration. The legal implications of James's announcement were clearly registering with several guests who possessed their own business and legal experience as conversations began developing among small groups about the potential liability issues surrounding the deceptive event planning and the false promises that had been made to secure their attendance. County Supervisor James Whitman was engaged in particularly animated discussion with other attendees about the municipal permit issues that might be involved in scheduling unauthorized events. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim's professional interest in the situation was obvious as she approached James to request copies of the legal documentation he was referencing clearly, recognizing that the evening's events might constitute fraud or deceptive business practices that could warrant official investigation. Her involvement would ensure that any potential criminal aspects of the family's deception would receive appropriate law enforcement attention. The social media documentation of James's legal announcement was spreading rapidly as guests shared videos and detailed accounts of the property ownership revelations with their own followers and social networks. The hashtags associated with Jessica's wedding were now being used to share information about family fraud and deceptive event planning rather than celebration photos, ensuring that the story would reach far beyond the people who had been physically present. The departure of the remaining guests accelerated significantly as people realized that they had been deceived about fundamental aspects of the event they had been invited to attend, with many expressing obvious anger about the time and money they had wasted on what they now understood had been an elaborate fraud perpetrated by the hosting family. The parking area that had been full of luxury vehicles earlier in the evening was now nearly empty, as people made rapid decisions to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal. Inside the villa, I could see my parents attempting to approach the gate to speak with James, presumably to challenge his legal pronouncements or negotiate some kind of resolution that might salvage their social standing. However, the construction barriers and official safety restrictions prevented them from reaching the area where James was speaking, leaving them trapped inside the property while their reputation was systematically destroyed in front of their intended audience. Jessica's emotional state had deteriorated to the point where she was clearly having a complete breakdown, her carefully planned wedding day having transformed into public humiliation and legal exposure that would follow her family for years to come. The contrast between her bridal preparation and the reality of her situation created a surreal image that several guests were capturing and sharing through social media platforms. The most telling aspect of watching the crowd's reaction to James's revelations was observing how quickly former friends and social connections distanced themselves from my family once the deceptive nature of their behavior became clear. People who had arrived expecting to celebrate with the Thompson family were now openly expressing anger about being manipulated and deceived, creating social consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate legal implications. And then the groom disappeared. Michael Rodriguez's sudden absence from the villa grounds became apparent to the remaining guests before my family even realized their groom had vanished, as several people began asking about his whereabouts when it became clear that someone needed to address the growing legal and social crisis that was destroying what remained of the wedding celebration. Through my binoculars, I could see guests looking around for Michael, expecting him to emerge and provide some explanation or take control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond anyone's ability to manage or contain. The discovery of his departure came when Jessica, still in her wedding dress, but now completely disheveled from hours of emotional breakdown, began searching frantically for her fiancé in the hope that he might somehow provide a solution to the nightmare her perfect day had become. I watched her move desperately through the villa grounds, calling his name with increasing panic, as she realized that the man who was supposed to be her partner in facing this crisis had simply disappeared without explanation or goodbye. The search for Michael revealed that he had taken not only his personal belongings, but also several expensive items from the villa that Jessica had assumed were wedding gifts intended for their future together. His overnight bag was gone from the guest room where he had been staying, along with a vintage watch collection that had belonged to my grandfather and several pieces of jewelry that Jessica had been planning to wear during their honeymoon. The systematic nature of his departure suggested careful planning rather than impulsive reaction to the evening's unexpected developments. More devastating was the discovery that Michael had withdrawn the maximum daily limit from Jessica's bank account using her debit card, which she had given him earlier in the week to handle last-minute wedding expenses. The timing of the withdrawal, which had occurred during the construction crew's arrival, indicated that he had recognized the implications of the evening's events and made immediate practical preparations for his exit, while Jessica was still focused on trying to salvage her celebration. The revelation of Michael's financial theft and abandonment transformed Jessica's emotional state from panicked distress to something approaching complete psychological collapse as she realized that the man she had planned to marry had been using her family's perceived wealth and social status as the primary motivation for their relationship. The wedding dress that had represented her dreams of romantic fulfillment now seemed like a costume for a performance that had been based entirely on deception and exploitation. The impact on my parents was equally devastating, though their response focused more on the social implications of having a groom abandon their daughter in front of prominent community members than on Jessica's emotional trauma. Dad's primary concern seemed to be managing the public relations disaster that was continuing to unfold in real time, while Mom struggled to process the implications of having invested months of planning and substantial financial resources in a celebration for a man who had apparently never intended to follow through with his commitments. The remaining guests were witnessing not just a wedding cancellation, but a complete family meltdown that revealed layers of deception and dysfunction far beyond the property ownership issues that had initially disrupted the celebration. Michael's abandonment added a cruel emotional dimension to what had already been an unprecedented social disaster, transforming the evening from an embarrassing logistical failure into a profound personal betrayal that would define Jessica's romantic history. Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times was documenting Michael's disappearance with the same professional thoroughness she had applied to the earlier legal revelations, recognizing that the groom's abandonment represented a significant escalation in the story that would make it even more compelling for her readers. The combination of family fraud, property deception, and romantic betrayal created exactly the kind of complex human drama that generated extensive media coverage and community discussion. The social media documentation of Michael's disappearance spread rapidly as guests shared updates about the groom's abandonment with their followers, adding another layer of humiliation to an evening that had already destroyed my family's social reputation throughout the community. The hashtags associated with Jessica's wedding were now being used to discuss romantic fraud and financial exploitation, in addition to the property and legal issues that had emerged earlier. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim's professional interest in the situation intensified when the financial theft became apparent as Michael's actions potentially constituted criminal fraud that would warrant official investigation and possible charges. Her presence ensured that the evening's events would receive appropriate law enforcement attention, particularly regarding the systematic financial exploitation that appeared to have been Michael's primary motivation for the relationship. The most heartbreaking aspect of watching Jessica's realization about Michael's true intentions was observing how completely she had been deceived about the nature of their relationship and his feelings toward her. The evidence of his planning and calculation in exploiting her family's circumstances revealed a level of manipulation that went far beyond simple opportunism into deliberate emotional and financial fraud that had been sustained over months of fake romantic commitment. The departure of the last remaining guests accelerated as people realized that they were witnessing not just a failed celebration, but a complete family breakdown involving fraud, abandonment, and financial theft that made continued presence inappropriate and potentially legally complicated. The few people who remained were primarily those with professional obligations to document the events or official responsibilities to investigate the various criminal and civil issues that had emerged. My parents' attempts to maintain some dignity in front of the departing guests were increasingly futile as the scope of the disaster continued expanding beyond anything they could reasonably explain or excuse. Their social standing, which had been built carefully over years of community involvement and relationship cultivation, was being destroyed in a single evening through a combination of their own deception and the cascading consequences of circumstances they had never anticipated. Jessica's realization that she had been systematically exploited by someone she had trusted completely added a personal dimension to the evening's revelations that made her emotional breakdown even more painful to witness, even from my position as the architect of the family's exposure. The contrast between her romantic expectations and the cold reality of Michael's financial motivations created a particularly cruel form of disillusionment that would affect her ability to trust romantic relationships for years to come. But an even more cruel truth was still waiting for them. The revelation that would push my family's disgrace beyond any possibility of redemption came at exactly 10:15, when I decided the time had arrived to deliver the financial documentation that would expose the full scope of their fraudulent behavior to the remaining witnesses. I made my way down from my observation point and approached the villa gates for the first time that evening, carrying a manila envelope containing bank records and legal documents that would destroy whatever credibility my parents still possessed with their extended family and community connections. My arrival at the scene generated immediate attention from the approximately 30 people who remained outside the villa, including several family members who had been desperately trying to reach me by phone throughout the evening's escalating disasters. The combination of relief at my appearance and anger about my perceived abandonment of the family during their crisis created a volatile emotional atmosphere that would make the impact of my revelations even more devastating.
"Sarah, thank God you're finally here,"
Dad called through the gate, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and reproach that suggested he viewed my absence as a betrayal of family loyalty during their most difficult hour. "We need you to explain to these people that there's been some kind of terrible misunderstanding about the property ownership and event authorization." His assumption that I would provide explanations that would somehow salvage their reputation revealed how completely he misunderstood my role in the evening's events and my current emotional state regarding their treatment of me over the years. The expectation that I would rescue them from consequences of their own deception demonstrated the same entitled thinking that had motivated their original demands for my villa. "Actually, Dad, I'm here to provide some additional clarity about family financial matters that I think everyone should know about," I replied, my voice carrying the kind of calm authority that immediately captured the attention of everyone within hearing range. "I have documentation that explains how some of the family's financial obligations have been managed over the years." I opened the manila envelope and withdrew bank records that showed a pattern of forged signatures on loan applications and financial documents spanning nearly 5 years' evidence that I had been collecting systematically since discovering my parents' fraudulent use of my identity and financial information. The documentation included photocopies of loan applications bearing my forged signature correspondence between my parents and various lenders, and evidence of funds that had been obtained through identity theft. These documents show that Robert and Patricia Thompson have been using my forged signature to obtain personal loans, credit lines, and financial instruments totaling over $150,000. I announced, speaking loudly enough for everyone present to hear clearly while holding up specific examples of the fraudulent paperwork. They've been representing themselves as authorized to sign on my behalf for major financial obligations that I never agreed to and never benefited from. The immediate reaction from the extended family members who were present was a combination of shock and growing anger as they realized that they were witnessing evidence of systematic financial fraud that had been conducted by people they had trusted and respected for decades. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had maintained relationships with my parents based on assumptions about their integrity and character were now confronting proof of deliberate criminal behavior. James Morrison stepped forward to authenticate the documentation I was presenting, his legal expertise, lending credibility to revelations that might otherwise have been dismissed as family dispute rather than criminal fraud. "I've reviewed these documents extensively, and they constitute clear evidence of identity theft, signature forgery, and fraudulent loan procurement that violates multiple state and federal financial crime statutes." The specific examples I shared with the assembled witnesses were particularly damning because they showed not only the scope of my parents' fraud, but also the calculated nature of their deception over an extended period. Bank records showed systematic patterns of forged signatures that had been used to obtain funds for various personal expenses, including payments for Jessica's college expenses, car purchases, and luxury vacations that the family had enjoyed while accumulating debt in my name. The most recent fraudulent loan application was filed just 3 months ago. I continued displaying documentation that showed my parents had attempted to secure additional credit using my identity, even while planning Jessica's wedding, and demanding use of my villa. They were continuing to steal my financial identity while simultaneously pressuring me to provide my home for their celebration. The impact on my extended family was immediate and devastating as relatives who had maintained close relationships with my parents began processing the implications of the fraud evidence and realizing that they might have been inadvertently involved in or benefited from criminal activity. The social dynamics within the group shifted dramatically as people began distancing themselves from my parents and expressing outrage about having been deceived about the family's true financial situation. Uncle Frank, my father's brother who had co-signed several business loans with Dad over the years, was visibly shaken as he realized that his own financial liability might be connected to fraudulent activities he had been unaware of. "Bob, are you telling me that all those business expansion loans we discussed were actually obtained through identity theft? I could be legally responsible for money that was stolen from your own daughter." The revelation that extended family members might face legal consequences for my parents' fraud created an additional layer of anger and betrayal that made any possibility of family reconciliation completely impossible. People who had supported my parents' financial ventures and social aspirations were now realizing that they had been manipulated into participating in criminal conspiracies without their knowledge or consent. Aunt Margaret, Mom's sister, who had helped plan and finance portions of Jessica's wedding celebration, expressed the kind of moral outrage that came from discovering that family members she had trusted completely had been systematically lying about fundamental aspects of their character and behavior. "Patricia, how could you let us contribute money to this wedding when you were stealing from Sarah to pay for it? We've all been participating in the proceeds of fraud without knowing it." The social media documentation of the financial fraud revelations spread rapidly as remaining guests shared information about my parents' criminal behavior with their followers and professional networks, ensuring that the story would reach throughout the community's business and legal circles, where financial crimes were taken particularly seriously. The evidence of systematic fraud would make rebuilding their reputation virtually impossible, even if they avoided criminal prosecution. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim's professional interest in the situation intensified significantly as the scope of the financial crimes became apparent, and she began taking detailed notes about the documentation I was presenting, while clearly recognizing that the evidence warranted immediate criminal investigation. Her involvement would ensure that the fraud would receive appropriate law enforcement attention, rather than being dismissed as a private family matter. The most devastating aspect of the financial revelations was watching my parents realize that their criminal behavior was being exposed not just to immediate family members, but to community leaders, media representatives, and law enforcement officials who would ensure that appropriate legal consequences followed. Their social and legal destruction was becoming comprehensive and permanent, rather than temporary embarrassment that might eventually be overcome. And then the relative they trusted most spoke up. The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Eleanor Chen, the 72-year-old family friend who had been working with the construction crew, and whom I had initially planned to introduce as a surprise witness much later in the evening. Eleanor stepped forward from the small group of remaining observers, removing her hard hat, to reveal the dignified bearing of someone who had been waiting decades for the right moment to speak a truth that would change everything about how my family's history was understood. "I can't stay silent any longer while watching this family destroy Sarah's life through lies that I helped them cover up 34 years ago." Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the moral authority that came from someone confessing their own participation in long-hidden wrongdoing. "That villa doesn't just legally belong to Sarah through purchase. It was always supposed to be hers through inheritance, but Robert and Patricia have been hiding the truth about her parentage and her rightful claim to family property for her entire life." The immediate impact of Eleanor's words on everyone present was profound and disorienting, as people struggled to process revelations that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about my family's history and my relationship to the property that had become the center of the evening's conflicts. My parents' faces displayed the kind of shock that came from watching their most carefully guarded secrets exposed by someone they had trusted to maintain their deception. Sarah is not Robert and Patricia's biological daughter. Eleanor continued, withdrawing a manila envelope from her jacket that contained documentation she had apparently been carrying for years while waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. She is the daughter of Robert's brother, Michael Thompson, and his wife, Catherine, who died in a car accident when Sarah was 18 months old. Robert and Patricia were supposed to be temporary guardians until proper adoption arrangements could be made through the family trust. The genealogical revelation created an immediate shift in how everyone present understood the family dynamics that had been playing out throughout the evening as relatives began processing the implications of learning that I was actually their niece rather than Robert and Patricia's daughter, and that my treatment by the people I had believed were my parents represented a much more serious form of abuse than simple favoritism. Eleanor's documentation included original birth certificates, death certificates for my biological parents, and legal papers establishing the trust fund that had been created for my benefit following my parents' deaths. The trust documents showed that my biological parents had owned significant property and financial assets, including the land where my villa now stood, and that these assets were supposed to have been held in trust for my benefit until I reached adulthood. The original family trust included the oceanfront property where Sarah built her villa, along with investment accounts and life insurance proceeds that should have totaled nearly $800,000 by the time she turned 18. Eleanor explained, displaying financial documents that revealed the scope of the inheritance that had been systematically stolen from me over the course of my entire life. Instead of administering the trust properly, Robert and Patricia used Sarah's identity to access the funds while raising her as their own child. The financial implications of Eleanor's revelations were staggering, as the assembled witnesses realized that the fraud I had just exposed was not simply a recent pattern of identity theft, but part of a decades-long conspiracy to steal my entire biological inheritance while exploiting my labor and resources as an adult. The systematic nature of the deception transformed my parents from ordinary financial criminals into people who had built their entire family structure around elaborate long-term fraud. James Morrison immediately began examining Eleanor's documentation with the kind of intense professional focus that suggested he was recognizing major legal implications that would require immediate action. If this documentation is authentic, we're looking at trust fund embezzlement, identity fraud, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of prison time, he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the full criminal scope of what was being revealed. The reaction from my extended family was a mixture of horror and rage as they realized that they had been unknowing participants in a conspiracy to defraud me of my biological inheritance, while watching Robert and Patricia exploit my generosity and financial resources as an adult. The family gatherings, celebrations, and relationships they had shared for decades were suddenly revealed to have been built on fundamental lies about identity, parentage, and financial crime. Uncle Frank's response was particularly emotional, as he processed the implications of learning that I was actually his nephew, Michael's daughter, rather than his brother Robert's child, and that Robert had been systematically stealing from his dead brother's trust fund while allowing Frank to believe that Michael's daughter had simply disappeared from family contact after the adoption. You let me think that Michael's little girl had been placed with a good family somewhere and was living a happy life when you were stealing her inheritance and treating her like a servant in your own home. The social media documentation of Eleanor's revelations spread immediately, as the remaining witnesses shared information about the family's decades-long conspiracy involving trust fund theft, identity fraud, and the systematic abuse of an orphaned child who had grown up believing her abusers were her parents. The story was evolving from wedding disaster into a complex criminal case that would attract regional and possibly national media attention. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim's professional assessment of the situation became much more serious as the scope of the criminal activity became apparent, and she began coordinating with other law enforcement agencies that would need to be involved in investigating trust fund embezzlement and conspiracy charges that crossed multiple jurisdictions and involved substantial financial crimes spanning decades. The transformation in how everyone present viewed me was immediate and dramatic, as I shifted from being perceived as someone who had sabotaged her family's celebration to being recognized as the victim of systematic abuse and financial exploitation, who had finally found the courage and resources to expose decades of criminal behavior. The sympathy and support that began emerging from the remaining witnesses felt surreal after years of being treated as the family problem rather than the family victim. My parents' attempts to deny or minimize Eleanor's revelations were completely futile in the face of comprehensive documentation and the testimony of someone who had been present during the original trust arrangements and had witnessed their systematic violation of their legal and moral obligations to protect my inheritance and welfare. The most satisfying aspect of watching the family's reaction to Eleanor's revelations was observing how completely their social and legal position had collapsed beyond any possibility of recovery or rehabilitation. As community members, family relatives, and law enforcement officials all recognized that they were dealing with sophisticated criminals rather than simply dysfunctional parents. But I wasn't stopping there. The complete reversal of power that I had orchestrated through months of careful planning reached its emotional crescendo when my father, Robert Thompson, the man who had stolen my inheritance and dismissed my worth for 34 years, slowly lowered himself to his knees on the gravel driveway outside my villa's locked gates. His expensive wedding suit, which had been perfectly pressed just hours earlier when he believed himself to be hosting the social event of the season, was now wrinkled and stained from the evening's escalating disasters, creating a visual representation of how thoroughly his carefully constructed facade had crumbled under the weight of exposed truth. The sight of this man who had never once apologized for decades of favoritism and exploitation, prostrating himself before me while construction barriers surrounded him, and legal documentation exposed his crimes, felt surreal in ways that no amount of planning could have prepared me to experience. The transformation from confident patriarch demanding my compliance to desperate criminal begging for mercy was so complete that even the remaining witnesses seemed stunned by the dramatic shift in family dynamics they were observing. "Sarah, please, I'm begging you to have mercy on us," he said, his voice breaking with genuine desperation as tears streamed down his face in front of people whose respect and approval had defined his social identity for decades. "We made terrible mistakes, catastrophic errors in judgment, but we're still your family, and families find ways to forgive each other and work through their problems together. We can make this right if you just give us one chance to prove that we've learned from our failures." His attempt to reframe decades of systematic fraud and abuse as simple mistakes revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood the scope of what he had done and the impossibility of any reconciliation that could restore trust between us. The gap between his perception of their behavior as correctable errors and the reality of their criminal conspiracy was so vast that his pleas sounded more like performance than genuine remorse. Mom joined him on the ground moments later, her elegant mother-of-the-bride dress becoming dirty as she knelt beside him in the gravel, while dozens of community leaders documented their public humiliation through photographs and social media posts that would circulate throughout Malibu's social circles for years to come. Patricia Thompson, who had perfected the art of making me feel invisible and unwanted, was now literally groveling for my attention while begging for consideration she had never shown when our positions were reversed. "Honey, we love you so much, and we know we haven't always expressed it in the right ways, but you're our daughter, and we're your parents, and that bond has to count for something meaningful." She sobbed, her carefully styled hair now disheveled from hours of crisis management that had accomplished nothing except accelerating their social destruction. "We made poor decisions about money and legal issues because we were under such tremendous financial pressure, but the love we have for you has always been real and genuine, and it's what should matter most in determining how we move forward from this terrible situation." Their continued attempts to minimize decades of identity theft and inheritance fraud as poor financial decisions made under pressure demonstrated their complete inability to acknowledge the true nature of their crimes or accept responsibility for the systematic destruction they had inflicted on my life while building their own comfortable existence on stolen resources. The reaction from the extended family members who remained among the witnesses was a mixture of embarrassment and disgust, as they watched Robert and Patricia debase themselves publicly while continuing to manipulate the emotional dynamics of the situation, rather than accepting accountability for criminal behavior that had been thoroughly documented and exposed. Relatives who had maintained relationships with them for decades were witnessing a complete breakdown of dignity that made continued association both socially and morally impossible. Jessica's response to watching her parents kneel in the dirt while begging for forgiveness was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the evening's revelations, as she finally began processing the full scope of how their deception and criminal activity had destroyed not just my life, but her own future prospects and social standing within the community she had worked so hard to impress. Her wedding dress, which had represented dreams of romantic fulfillment and social triumph just hours earlier, now seemed like a costume for a tragedy that had been building for years. "This is all your fault," Jessica screamed at our parents, her voice carrying the kind of uncontrolled rage that came from someone whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered by discovering that the people she trusted most had been systematically lying about fundamental aspects of their family's history and financial situation. "You destroyed my wedding. You destroyed my relationship. You ruined my reputation in front of everyone who matters in this community. And now I find out that everything I thought I knew about our family's success was built on lies and stolen money." Her accusations revealed a complete transformation in how she understood family dynamics, as she began recognizing that her privileged position had been funded through criminal activity and that her social standing was now permanently damaged by association with systematic fraud that would follow her for the rest of her life. The realization that she had been an unknowing beneficiary of stolen inheritance money was adding layers of guilt and shame to her anger about the destruction of her carefully planned celebration. "You made me complicit in stealing from Sarah without ever telling me the truth about what you were doing or where our money was really coming from." Jessica continued, her voice becoming increasingly hysterical as she processed the implications of having built her entire adult lifestyle around resources that had been obtained through criminal conspiracy. "Every car you bought me, every tuition payment you made, every vacation we took as a family, every advantage I've had in life was paid for with money that belonged to Sarah. I've been living off stolen funds my entire life, and now everyone in Malibu knows it." The family unity that they had attempted to maintain in the face of public exposure was crumbling as Jessica turned against the parents who had created the situation, recognizing that their criminal behavior had made her an unwitting participant in systematic fraud that would define her social identity throughout the community for years to come. The bonds that had held our dysfunctional family together were disintegrating under the weight of revealed truth and unavoidable consequences. Uncle Frank's intervention added another dimension to the family's public breakdown as he approached the gate to express his own outrage about having been deceived into participating in what he now understood had been a criminal conspiracy involving trust fund embezzlement and identity theft. "Bob, you let me co-sign business loans and make family investments based on completely false information about your financial situation and Sarah's legal status. You've made me potentially liable for criminal activity that I never would have supported if I had known the truth about what you were doing." The realization that their deception had implicated extended family members in potential criminal liability created additional layers of anger and betrayal that made any possibility of family reconciliation completely impossible, as people who had trusted and supported them for decades began calculating their own legal exposure and financial risk from having unknowingly participated in fraudulent activities. My own response to their desperate pleas and emotional manipulation was characterized by a calmness that surprised even me, as I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but also no inclination toward the forgiveness they were demanding. The years of therapy and personal growth that had prepared me for this moment had taught me to recognize their behavior patterns and protect myself from being drawn back into cycles of abuse disguised as family loyalty and obligation. "The family was broken long ago," I said, my voice carrying clearly to everyone present while maintaining the kind of composed authority that came from finally understanding my own worth and refusing to accept responsibility for damage I had not created. "Today is just the day that everyone else gets to see what I've been living with for 34 years. You don't get to steal someone's entire life, destroy their sense of identity and belonging, exploit their generosity while treating them like a burden, and then expect forgiveness simply because you've finally been caught and held accountable for your actions. The finality in my response seemed to crush whatever hope my parents had maintained that they could somehow manipulate their way out of the consequences they were facing, and their continued pleas became increasingly desperate and incoherent as they realized that their former victim was no longer vulnerable to the emotional manipulation and guilt tactics that had controlled our family dynamics for decades. Eleanor Chen's presence, as both witness and historical validator, provided crucial context that helped everyone understand how long this deception had been maintained and how thoroughly my entire life had been constructed around lies that were finally being corrected through public accountability and legal intervention. Her documentation of the original crimes and her testimony about my biological parents' intentions for my inheritance gave weight to the justice that was finally being achieved. The remaining witnesses were documenting every aspect of my family's emotional breakdown through photographs and social media posts that would ensure the story continued spreading throughout the community long after the evening ended, creating a permanent record of their public humiliation and criminal exposure that would follow them for the rest of their lives, regardless of whatever legal consequences they might face. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim was coordinating with additional law enforcement personnel who had arrived to begin the formal investigation process that would lead to criminal charges, arrest warrants, and legal proceedings that would determine how many years my parents would spend in prison for their decades of fraud, identity theft, and systematic abuse of someone they had been entrusted to protect and nurture. The contrast between my composed demeanor and my family's complete emotional collapse was being noted and documented by everyone present as people realized they were witnessing someone who had not only survived systematic abuse, but had developed the strength and intelligence necessary to expose her abusers and achieve justice through legal and social channels, rather than personal vengeance or destructive retaliation. And I was preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. The moment had arrived to transform what could have been perceived as personal vengeance into something far more meaningful and socially constructive, elevating the evening's events from family drama into a powerful statement about justice, community responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable individuals who had experienced similar abuse and systematic exploitation. Standing before the assembled witnesses, media representatives, law enforcement officials, and remaining family members, I prepared to announce a decision that would recontextualize everything that had transpired and demonstrate that my motivations extended far beyond personal satisfaction into genuine social reform and healing. I want everyone here to understand that tonight's events were never about revenge, personal vindication, or destroying my family for the satisfaction of watching them suffer. I began my voice carrying clearly to all the remaining witnesses while maintaining the composed authority that had characterized my demeanor throughout the evening's carefully orchestrated revelations. They were about establishing accountability for systematic abuse, exposing criminal behavior that has been hidden for decades, and ensuring that other victims of family financial exploitation have access to resources and support necessary to seek justice for themselves. The immediate attention my announcement received was complete and focused as people realized I was about to provide context that would explain the careful planning, legal precision, and moral foundation that had characterized every aspect of the evening's events. The journalists present recognized that they were witnessing a story that extended far beyond local family drama into broader social issues about elder abuse, inheritance, fraud, financial exploitation, and the protection of vulnerable family members who often suffer in silence. Effective immediately, I am donating this villa and all surrounding property to establish the Katherine Thompson Foundation for Family Financial Abuse Survivors. I continued referencing my biological mother's name while announcing a decision that would transform the site of my family's humiliation into a permanent resource for other victims of similar crimes and systematic exploitation. The foundation will provide comprehensive legal assistance, temporary housing, financial counseling, and emotional support for women and men who have been exploited, manipulated, or defrauded by family members who violated their trust and stole their resources. The impact of my announcement on the assembled crowd was immediate and profound, as people began processing the implications of learning that the property at the center of the evening's conflicts would be dedicated to helping other victims of family abuse, rather than remaining as my personal residence or being sold for profit. The moral dimension of my decision elevated my actions from personal justice to social advocacy in ways that would resonate throughout the community and inspire other victims to seek help and accountability. Lisa Martinez from the Malibu Times was documenting my announcement with obvious recognition that the charitable foundation represented a significant development that would transform how the story was perceived and reported by media outlets throughout the region and beyond. The combination of family fraud exposure, criminal prosecution, and charitable response would create exactly the kind of complex human interest story that generated extensive coverage, community discussion, and social change initiatives. The foundation will work closely with law enforcement agencies, legal professionals, and social services organizations to identify patterns of family financial abuse and provide resources for successful prosecution of these crimes. I explained, outlining a mission that would extend my personal experience into systematic social change and prevention programs. Too many victims remain silent and isolated because they lack the resources, knowledge, or emotional support necessary to seek justice against family members who exploit their trust, steal their inheritance, or manipulate their financial security. Eleanor Chen's emotional response to hearing my biological mother's name associated with the foundation was visible and deeply moving as she realized that the property where Catherine Thompson's daughter had been systematically abused and exploited would now serve as a place of healing support and empowerment for other victims of similar crimes. Her presence provided historical continuity that connected my current advocacy work to the family legacy that had been stolen from me decades earlier. The reaction from my extended family members was a mixture of shame, recognition, and grudging respect, as they realized that my response to decades of abuse was not bitterness, isolation, or destructive revenge, but a commitment to protecting other people who might experience similar exploitation while building something positive from the pain that had been inflicted on me. The contrast between my constructive response and my parents' destructive behavior was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone present. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim's professional assessment of the foundation announcement was clearly positive, as she recognized that the organization would serve as a valuable resource for law enforcement agencies investigating complex family financial crimes, while providing advocacy and support for victims who often struggled to navigate the legal system alone. Her expression suggested appreciation for an initiative that would strengthen criminal justice efforts while addressing the emotional and practical needs of abuse survivors. The foundation will also establish educational programs to help families recognize warning signs of financial exploitation and provide training for legal professionals, social workers, and law enforcement personnel who work with victims of family abuse. I continued describing initiatives that would address both prevention and response to crimes that often remained hidden within families for years or decades before being exposed. The social media response to my charitable announcement was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive as people shared information about the foundation, with comments praising my transformation of personal trauma into community service and social advocacy. The contrast between my constructive response to systematic abuse and my family's criminal behavior was generating exactly the kind of positive publicity that would help the foundation attract donors, volunteers, and professional supporters committed to its mission. County Supervisor James Whitman approached the gate to express his personal and professional support for the Foundation's mission, recognizing its potential value in addressing family financial abuse throughout the region, while providing a model for similar initiatives in other communities. His endorsement would provide political legitimacy and potential government funding opportunities for the Foundation's work with law enforcement and social services agencies. The villa will be renovated to include counseling facilities, legal consultation offices, temporary housing for victims who need safe refuge while pursuing justice, and educational spaces for community workshops about financial abuse prevention. I explained, describing plans that would transform the property from a private residence into a comprehensive resource center for family abuse survivors and prevention education. The most satisfying aspect of announcing the foundation was observing how completely it reframed the evening's narrative from personal revenge story to social justice advocacy, transforming me from someone who had destroyed a family celebration into someone who had exposed criminal behavior while creating lasting resources to help other victims achieve justice and healing. The moral authority that came from channeling personal pain into community service was undeniable and inspiring to everyone present. My parents' continued pleas for forgiveness and family reconciliation became increasingly pathetic and inappropriate in the context of my announcement about using their crimes as motivation for helping other victims, as people realized that they were witnessing someone whose response to systematic abuse was protecting others rather than seeking personal gain or satisfaction from their abuser's suffering. The foundation will maintain a legal advocacy program that provides pro bono representation for victims who cannot afford attorneys, along with a financial recovery program that helps survivors reclaim stolen assets and rebuild their economic security. I added, describing services that would address the practical barriers that often prevented abuse victims from seeking justice or achieving independence from exploitative family relationships. The documentation and media coverage of the foundation announcement would ensure that the story continued generating positive attention for victim advocacy and family abuse prevention long after my parents' legal proceedings concluded, creating a lasting legacy that honored my biological parents' memory while serving people who had experienced similar exploitation and manipulation. The transformation of my villa from the site of family fraud and systematic abuse into the headquarters for an organization dedicated to preventing similar crimes represented exactly the kind of poetic justice that would resonate with community members and inspire other victims to seek help and accountability for their own situations while building stronger support networks for abuse survivors. But they had no idea I had one more secret. The final revelation that would demonstrate the true scope of my strategic planning and financial independence came as I stood before the assembled witnesses, having just announced my charitable intentions, while my family knelt in the gravel pleading for forgiveness they would never receive. The moment had arrived to share the secret that would show everyone present that my victory was not just moral and legal, but also practical and complete in ways that ensured my future prosperity and happiness far exceeded anything my family had ever provided or could ever take away from me. What none of you know. I began, my voice carrying the confident satisfaction of someone who had planned every detail of this evening with precision that extended far beyond the immediate satisfaction of exposing family fraud, is that I purchased a second property 18 months ago, long before any of tonight's events were set in motion. The villa you see behind me, while beautiful and meaningful, was never my only home or my primary residence. The immediate reaction from the crowd was a mixture of surprise and growing admiration as people began processing the implications of learning that my charitable donation represented strategic planning rather than financial sacrifice, and that my actions throughout the evening had been motivated by abundance rather than desperation or revenge-driven destruction of my own security and stability. The new property is a 7-bedroom estate in Montecito, situated on 12 acres with ocean views that surpass anything visible from this location. I continued, describing a home that represented not just upgrade in luxury and space, but a complete transformation in my relationship to wealth, property, and personal autonomy. I've been living there quietly for the past year while maintaining this villa as my official address for exactly the purpose it served tonight. The strategic brilliance of maintaining 2 residences while using one as the stage for my family's exposure was becoming apparent to everyone present, as they realized that my willingness to donate the Malibu villa stemmed from having already secured superior living arrangements that my family had never known existed. The depth of my planning and the extent of my resources were revealing themselves as far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Eleanor Chen's expression showed particular appreciation for the completeness of my preparation and protection, as she recognized that my biological parents' stolen inheritance had been more than recovered through my own professional success and careful financial planning. Her smile suggested pride in watching the orphaned child she had helped protect finally achieve not just justice, but prosperity that honored her parents' memory and provided security for her future. The Montecito estate includes a wine cellar, art studio, library, and guest quarters that will serve as my private residence while I oversee the Catherine Thompson Foundation's operations from the Malibu property. I explained, outlining a life plan that combined personal luxury with meaningful social work in ways that would provide both comfort and purpose for years to come. I'll be able to maintain my privacy and peace while remaining actively involved in helping other victims of family financial abuse. The contrast between my careful planning and my family's improvised crisis management was becoming increasingly stark as people realized that while they had been scheming to exploit my resources and manipulate my emotions, I had been building an independent life that made their approval or support completely irrelevant to my happiness and security. Their decades of emotional manipulation had been rendered powerless by my financial independence and strategic thinking. James Morrison's professional assessment of my real estate portfolio was clearly impressed, as he recognized that my property holdings represented substantial wealth accumulation that demonstrated both financial acumen and long-term planning capabilities that contradicted any narrative about my being vulnerable to family manipulation or dependent on their approval for my well-being and success. The social media response to my revelation about the Montecito estate was immediate and enthusiastic, as people shared information about my success story, with comments praising my strategic intelligence and financial independence. The narrative was completing its transformation from family drama to inspirational story about someone who had overcome systematic abuse to achieve prosperity and use her success to help other victims. The Montecito property was purchased entirely with my own earnings and investments, with no financial assistance or co-signing from any family members. I added, emphasizing the complete independence that characterized my current life and future plans. Every aspect of my new home reflects my own choices, taste, and vision for my life, without any compromises or accommodations for people who never valued my happiness or respected my autonomy. The description of my independent success was particularly meaningful for the women present who had experienced their own struggles with family dynamics and financial autonomy, as they recognized in my story a model for how professional achievement and careful planning could provide the foundation for complete independence from toxic family relationships. My parents' continued pleas for reconciliation became increasingly pathetic in the context of learning that I had already built a new life that exceeded anything they could offer or threaten to take away from me. Their assumption that I needed their approval or inclusion in family activities was being revealed as completely delusional based on outdated perceptions of my vulnerability and dependence. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim's professional interest in my financial independence was clearly positive, as she recognized that my success story provided a powerful example of how abuse victims could achieve justice and prosperity through legal channels and personal determination, rather than remaining trapped in cycles of manipulation and exploitation. The interior design of the Montecito estate reflects influences from my travels throughout Europe and Asia over the past 2 years, trips that provided perspective on how much of the world exists beyond the narrow social circles and family dynamics that once defined my entire reality. I continued describing experiences that demonstrated how completely I had moved beyond the limitations that my family had tried to impose on my understanding of what was possible for my life. The revelation that I had been traveling internationally while maintaining the appearance of local focus and family dedication showed the extent to which I had been living a double life that protected my true interests and experiences from family interference and manipulation. Their assumption that they understood my life and limitations was being revealed as completely inaccurate. County Supervisor James Whitman's response to learning about my Montecito residence was clearly impressed, as he recognized that my property holdings placed me among the region's most successful residents, and that my charitable work would be supported by substantial personal resources that ensured the foundation's long-term sustainability and effectiveness. The wine cellar includes collections from Napa Valley, Tuscany, and Bordeaux that represent both investment portfolio diversification and personal enjoyment of experiences that my family never introduced me to or encouraged me to explore. I explained, describing a lifestyle that demonstrated complete transformation from the constrained existence they had tried to maintain as my normal reality. The library in my new home contained first edition literature art books and philosophy texts that reflected intellectual interests I had been developing independently, while my family remained focused on shallow social status and material acquisition that now seemed pathetic in comparison to the depth and sophistication of my actual interests and capabilities. The guest quarters were designed to accommodate visits from friends and colleagues I had met through professional networking and travel experiences, relationships that were built on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than the obligation and manipulation that had characterized my family interactions for decades. That was when I received a letter. The letter arrived at exactly the moment when the evening's revelations had reached their crescendo, delivered by a courier who had been waiting in the shadows for the precise timing that would maximize the emotional impact of what would prove to be the final piece of my family's story. Eleanor Chen approached me with an envelope that bore the elegant handwriting of my biological grandmother Catherine's mother, whom I had never known existed until this moment, but whose presence in my life was about to be revealed as both profound and enduring. This letter was written by your grandmother, Margaret Catherine Sullivan, 3 years ago, when she learned that Eleanor had finally located you and confirmed your identity. Eleanor explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been entrusted with delivering a message that would complete the circle of justice and love that had been broken so many decades earlier. She passed away last winter, but she made me promise to deliver this to you at exactly the right moment when you had finally claimed your rightful place in the world and achieved the justice that your parents would have wanted for you. The envelope was made of heavy cream paper with my name written in the kind of careful script that belonged to someone who understood the importance of this communication and had taken great care to ensure that every word would convey the depth of emotion and pride that distance and deception had prevented her from sharing during her lifetime. The weight of the letter in my hands felt substantial, suggesting contents that extended beyond simple greeting into something more comprehensive and meaningful. As I opened the envelope in front of the assembled witnesses, the silence that fell over the remaining crowd was complete and respectful as people recognized that they were about to witness the conclusion of a story that had transformed from family drama into something approaching literary tragedy and redemption. The media representatives understood that this moment would provide the emotional resolution that would make their coverage of the evening's events resonate with readers who were seeking hope and healing in their own complicated family relationships. The letter itself was written on matching stationery in the same elegant handwriting, with words that had been chosen carefully to provide comfort, validation, and guidance to a granddaughter who had grown up believing she was alone in the world, while struggling against family members who had stolen not just her inheritance, but her connection to people who would have loved her unconditionally throughout her life. My dearest Sarah. The letter began. I have spent the last 15 years of my life searching for you through private investigators and legal channels, hoping to reconnect with my daughter Catherine's child and ensure that you receive the love and support that your parents intended you to have throughout your life. Learning about the deception and abuse you have endured has broken my heart, while simultaneously filling me with pride at the strength and character you have developed, despite circumstances that would have destroyed many people. The immediate emotional impact of reading words from a grandmother who had been searching for me while I believed myself completely alone in my struggle against family exploitation was overwhelming in ways that I had not anticipated. The validation that came from learning that someone had been fighting for me from a distance while I fought for myself in isolation provided a sense of connection and belonging that had been missing from my entire adult life. Your parents, Michael and Catherine, were extraordinary people who built successful businesses and meaningful relationships throughout their community, while always maintaining that family love and support were the most important values anyone could embrace. The letter continued, providing information about my biological parents that gave context to the values and drive that had enabled me to survive and ultimately triumph over the people who had stolen my inheritance and identity. They established trust funds and educational accounts that were intended to ensure your security and provide opportunities for you to pursue whatever dreams and ambitions emerged as you grew into the remarkable woman I always knew you would become. The fact that these resources were stolen from you while you were too young to protect yourself represents a betrayal that would have devastated them, but your success in overcoming that betrayal and achieving prosperity through your own efforts would have made them incredibly proud. The letter went on to describe my biological parents' personalities, interests, and aspirations in ways that helped me understand where my own values and capabilities had originated, providing a sense of genetic and emotional continuity that had been completely absent from my relationship with the people who had raised me, while systematically exploiting my resources and dismissing my worth. Catherine was a brilliant architect who designed homes that prioritized both beauty and functionality, while Michael was an engineer whose innovations in sustainable construction techniques earned recognition throughout California's building industry. My grandmother had written explaining professional achievements that provided context for my own success in technology and strategic planning. They would have been fascinated by your career accomplishments and impressed by the sophisticated planning that enabled you to achieve justice while protecting your own interests and security. The most emotionally powerful section of the letter addressed the isolation and self-doubt that had characterized my experience growing up in a family that had systematically undermined my confidence while exploiting my generosity and financial contributions to their lifestyle and Jessica's opportunities. You are never alone, my dear granddaughter, and you never have been alone even during the darkest periods of your struggle against people who should have protected and supported you. My grandmother had written in words that seemed to address directly the loneliness and confusion that had motivated so many of my attempts to earn love from people who were incapable of genuine affection. Justice always stands with you, love always surrounds you, and family always supports you even when the people who claim to be your family have failed to honor the obligations that true family relationships require. The letter concluded with practical information about additional inheritance assets that my grandmother had been protecting in accounts that Robert and Patricia had never discovered, including investment portfolios and real estate holdings that would ensure my financial security while providing additional resources for the Catherine Thompson Foundation's mission of helping other victims of family financial abuse. These assets represent not charity or gift, but restoration of what was always rightfully yours, and what your parents intended you to have as foundation for building whatever life would make you happy and fulfilled. The letter explained describing resources that would enable me to expand my charitable work while maintaining the luxurious lifestyle I had created through my own professional success. The reaction from the remaining witnesses to my grandmother's letter was deeply emotional as people recognized that they had witnessed not just the exposure of family fraud, but the restoration of love and connection that had been stolen along with my financial inheritance. The story was completing its transformation from tragedy to triumph in ways that provided hope and inspiration for other people who had experienced family betrayal or abandonment. Eleanor Chen's emotional response to delivering the letter was particularly moving, as she had carried the responsibility of reconnecting me with my biological family's love while watching me endure years of abuse from people who had been entrusted with my care and protection. Her relief at finally completing the mission that my grandmother had assigned to her was visible and profound. The letter also included photographs of my biological parents' grandmother and extended family members who had been searching for me while I grew up, believing myself to be alone and unwanted. The faces in these pictures bore striking resemblances to my own features, providing visual confirmation of genetic connections that had been hidden from me throughout my life. My parents' continued pleas for forgiveness and family reconciliation became completely irrelevant in the context of learning that I had always belonged to a family that valued and loved me even from a distance, and that the abuse I had endured represented betrayal, not just of trust, but of sacred obligations to protect and nurture the child they had been entrusted to raise with love and integrity. The evening's events had reached their perfect conclusion with the restoration of family love and the promise of continued support from people who understood my worth and would celebrate my success rather than exploiting my generosity while undermining my confidence and security. And I knew that my story was just beginning. 3 months later, I stood on the private beach of my Montecito estate as the sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the complete transformation my life had undergone since that unforgettable evening when justice had finally prevailed over decades of systematic abuse and exploitation. The waves that crashed gently against the pristine sand below my clifftop property carried with them a sense of peace and closure that I had never imagined possible during the years when I believed that my worth was determined by my family's approval and that love could be earned through endless accommodation of their demands. The contrast between my current emotional state and the anxiety that had characterized my existence throughout my 20s and early 30s was so profound that it sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life, inhabiting a reality where my needs and happiness were prioritized rather than dismissed, where my success was celebrated rather than minimized, and where my future was defined by possibilities rather than obligations to people who had never valued my contributions or respected my autonomy. The Katherine Thompson Foundation had exceeded every expectation I had established when I announced its creation during that dramatic evening at the Malibu Villa, with donations and volunteer commitments pouring in from throughout California and beyond, as people responded to a mission that resonated with their own experiences of family dysfunction and financial exploitation. The Foundation's legal clinic had already helped 47 victims of family financial abuse pursue criminal charges and civil recovery against relatives who had stolen their inheritance savings or identity, while the temporary housing program had provided safe refuge for 23 women who had escaped families that treated them as financial resources rather than beloved daughters. The media coverage of my story had generated hundreds of letters from women across the country who shared their own experiences of family favoritism, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse, creating a community of survivors who supported each other's healing while working together to prevent similar crimes against vulnerable family members. The Foundation's website had become a resource center where people could find legal guidance, emotional support, and practical assistance for escaping toxic family dynamics that had trapped them in cycles of manipulation and exploitation. Eleanor Chen had become not just a trusted advisor to the Foundation, but a surrogate grandmother whose presence in my life provided the unconditional love and wisdom that had been missing throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Her stories about my biological parents had helped me understand the origins of my values, ambitions, and capabilities, while her consistent encouragement and support had reinforced my confidence in the choices I had made to prioritize justice and healing over revenge and bitterness. The legal proceedings against Robert and Patricia Thompson had concluded with prison sentences that reflected the serious nature of their crimes, while Jessica had negotiated a plea agreement that required her to make restitution for her participation in spending money that had been stolen from my inheritance. The criminal convictions had made recovery of the stolen assets more straightforward, though the financial compensation had been less important to me than the public acknowledgement that their behavior had been criminal rather than simply dysfunctional. Michael Rodriguez had been arrested attempting to board a flight to Mexico with Jessica's jewelry and savings, leading to additional charges for theft and fraud that would keep him incarcerated for several years, while providing closure for Jessica about the true nature of their relationship. His prosecution had revealed a pattern of romantic fraud targeting women from wealthy families, making Jessica one of several victims who had been systematically exploited by someone who specialized in identifying and manipulating vulnerable targets. The transformation of the Malibu Villa into the Foundation's headquarters had been completed with architectural modifications that honored the property's natural beauty while creating functional spaces for counseling services, legal consultations, and support group meetings. The location where my family had planned to celebrate Jessica's fraudulent wedding had become a place where other victims found the courage and resources necessary to seek justice and rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. My professional career had flourished in ways that demonstrated how much energy had been drained by the constant stress of managing toxic family relationships. As my work performance improved dramatically once I was no longer worried about emergency financial requests or emotional manipulation that had previously disrupted my focus and creativity. The promotion to senior architect that I had received 6 weeks after the foundation's establishment had come with recognition that my leadership capabilities had been consistently underutilized during the years when family crisis management had absorbed so much of my attention and emotional resources. The social connections I had developed through foundation work and community involvement had introduced me to people who valued authenticity, compassion, and justice rather than social status, financial resources, or family connections, creating friendships that were based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or manipulation. The dinner parties and cultural events I now attended were characterized by intellectual stimulation and genuine care, rather than the competitive dynamics that had defined my family's social gatherings. The romantic relationship that had developed with David Martinez, an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases and had volunteered his services to the foundation, was built on the kind of equality and mutual support that I had never experienced during my years of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of genuine affection. Our partnership was characterized by encouragement of each other's professional goals, celebration of individual achievements, and shared commitment to social justice work that made both of our lives more meaningful and fulfilling. The interior design of my Montecito estate reflected my personal taste and interests rather than compromises with family members who had different aesthetic preferences or financial limitations, creating living spaces that felt truly mine in ways that the Malibu villa never had, despite being purchased entirely with my own earnings. The art collection I had been building included works by emerging artists whose creativity and vision inspired my own continued growth and self-discovery. The wine cellar had become a place where I entertained friends and colleagues who appreciated both the quality of the vintages and the stories behind their selection, sharing meals and conversations that enriched my understanding of the world, while providing the kind of intellectual and emotional stimulation that had been absent from family gatherings where my contributions were dismissed or ignored. The guest quarters had hosted visits from other foundation donors and volunteers who had become genuine friends, along with family abuse survivors who needed temporary refuge while pursuing legal action against their own exploitative relatives, creating a sense of purpose and community that made every day feel meaningful rather than simply obligatory. Standing on this beach, watching the sunset paint the ocean in colors that seemed to celebrate freedom and possibility, I reflected on how completely my understanding of family love and success had been transformed by the courage to finally stop accepting unacceptable treatment and demand the respect and consideration that every person deserves from the people who claim to love them. The message that had emerged from my experience was one that I shared with every foundation client and every woman who contacted us, seeking guidance about her own family situation. It is never too late to stand up for justice, never too late to demand better treatment, never too late to walk away from people who exploit your kindness while offering nothing but criticism and manipulation in return. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had taught me that real strength comes not from enduring abuse, but from refusing to accept it, that genuine love supports rather than exploits, and that family relationships should provide security and encouragement rather than anxiety and financial drain. As I turned away from the ocean and walked toward my estate, leaving behind the last traces of doubt about whether I had made the right choices in exposing my family's crimes and building a new life based on authenticity rather than accommodation, I felt complete confidence that the path I had chosen was leading toward continued growth, happiness, and meaningful contribution to making the world safer for other people who deserved better than they were receiving from families who had forgotten what love actually means. And that was the day I knew I had truly won. Sarah's story proves that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and demand the respect you deserve. From a woman who spent 34 years being treated as her family's personal ATM to becoming a powerful advocate for abuse survivors, Her journey shows us that justice is possible when we find the courage to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. The Katherine Thompson Foundation continues to help hundreds of family abuse survivors every year, providing legal assistance, safe housing, and the support needed to escape toxic relationships and rebuild independent lives. Sarah's villa, once the site of her family's cruelest betrayal, now serves as a beacon of hope for people who thought they had nowhere to turn. Her parents served 6 years in federal prison for inheritance fraud and identity theft, while Jessica rebuilt her life away from the social circles that had witnessed her humiliation. Michael Rodriguez was convicted of romantic fraud and received additional sentences for his pattern of targeting vulnerable women from wealthy families. But perhaps the most powerful part of Sarah's story is how she transformed decades of pain into a mission that protects others. She didn't just survive her family's abuse, she used it to create something meaningful that continues changing lives every single day. What do you think about Sarah's approach to dealing with family betrayal? Have you or someone you know experienced similar treatment from relatives who were supposed to love and support you? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear that they're not alone and that justice is possible. If Sarah's journey resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories about people who found the strength to transform their pain into power. We share real stories about ordinary people who discovered extraordinary courage when they decided they deserved better treatment from the people in their lives. Remember, family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the people who truly value and support you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who claim to love you, but consistently treat you as if your feelings and needs don't matter. Drop a comment and let us know what you would have done in Sarah's situation. Would you have exposed your family's crimes so publicly, or would you have handled the situation differently? Your perspective could help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics and wondering what options they have for protecting themselves. Don't forget to like this video if Sarah's story moved you, and share it with anyone who might need to hear that it's possible to overcome family abuse and build a life filled with genuine love and respect. Together we can help more people recognize that they deserve better and have the power to create positive change in their lives and communities.